Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Nightmare Narratives. I can picture some of you already in bed, maybe some of you just getting home from work. Wherever you are, whatever time it is, I'm glad you're here. If this helps you relax or sleep, please like and subscribe. It means a lot. Now let's get you comfortable, and I'll tell you tonight's story. My name is Daniel Ashford, and I've been a park ranger for 17 years. I've pulled lost hikers out of ravines, tracked down missing campers in blizzards, and helped people through the worst days of their lives. In all that time, I never believed in the old mountain spirits my granny used to talk about. She'd sit on her porch, pointing toward Blackwater Ridge with her gnarled finger, warning me about things that collected bones in the deep woods. I thought she was just trying to keep me from wandering too far from home. I was wrong. It started on October 23rd, 1978. I remember the date because it was the same day my grandfather died in the mine collapse 40 years earlier. Granny always said bad things happened when the mountain got restless around that time. The call came in just after dawn. 3 geology students from Virginia Tech had missed their check-in. Their professor expected them back Sunday night, but Monday morning came and went with no word. The students were studying the old coal mines up on Blackwater Ridge. Good kids, according to their professor. Smart, careful, well-prepared. Not the type to wander off or ignore safety protocols. Their names were Sarah Chen, Michael Rodriguez, and David Winters. All seniors, all experienced hikers. I drove my truck as far as the old logging road would take me, then hiked the last 3 miles to their last known position. The October air was sharp and clean, carrying the smell of dying leaves and wood smoke from distant cabins. Fresh snow had fallen overnight, unusual for this early in the season, creating a thin white blanket over everything. I found their campsite easily enough. 3 tents arranged in a neat triangle, a cold fire pit with stones placed just right, food hung properly in bear bags. Everything looked normal until I started looking closer. The disturbed earth around their camp made my skin crawl. Not footprints or normal scuffed ground, perfect circles of torn up dirt, each about 6 feet across. 5 of them, arranged around the campsite like points on a star. The soil inside each circle was darker than it should be, almost black, and nothing grew there. Not even weeds. I knelt beside one of the circles, pulling out my radio. "Base, this is Ashford. I'm at the geology students' campsite. Something's not right here." Static answered me. I tried again, adjusting the frequency. Nothing but white noise. The silence hit me next. In 17 years of working these mountains, I'd never heard anything like it. Not quiet. Silent. Like the mountain was holding its breath. No birds, no insects, no wind through the trees. Even my own breathing sounded too loud. I checked my compass. The needle spun wildly, unable to find magnetic north. My watch had stopped at 3:17, though I'd wound it that morning. The temperature felt wrong too, cold enough to see my breath when it had been nearly 50 degrees at the parking area. Inside the largest tent, I found Sarah's field notebook. Her handwriting was neat and precise until the last entry. October 22, 6:30 p.m. Strange bone fragments found near mine entrance, arranged in deliberate patterns. David thinks they're from deer, but the size is wrong. Some pieces look almost human. We'll investigate further tomorrow. October 22, 11:45 p.m. Woke to sounds outside, like clicking, but rhythmic. Michael went to check and came back white as a sheet. Says he saw something moving between the trees. Something tall. October 23, 2:15 a.m. They're in the camp now. Oh God, they're taking the bones from our dinner. Building something with them. I can see them through the tent wall. They're not human. They're not times. The entry ended there, pencil scratched across the page like she'd been interrupted mid-word. I spent the next hour searching the area, following every trail and checking every hiding spot I could find. No sign of the students, no footprints leading away from camp. No torn clothing or blood or any indication of what might have happened to them. But I kept finding more of those bone circles. They dotted the mountainside like a disease, each one identical to the others. Dark earth, perfect circumference, empty except for that wrongness that made my teeth ache. I counted 12 of them within a half mile of the campsite. As afternoon shadows grew longer, I made a decision that probably saved my life. I hiked back down to my truck and drove to town, where my radio worked just fine. I called in a full search and rescue operation, requesting additional rangers and a state police forensics team. "You sure about this, Daniel?" asked my supervisor, Ranger Captain Mills. 3 college kids could have wandered off for any number of reasons. I thought about those bone circles, about Sarah's notebook, about the silence that felt like death. "I'm sure, Cap. We need all the help we can get." That night, I sat on my porch with a bottle of beer and my grandfather's old hunting rifle across my knees. The beer went warm while I stared toward Blackwater Ridge, watching fog roll down from the peaks like gray fingers reaching into the valleys below. For the first time in my adult life, I found myself thinking about Granny's stories, about things that moved through the mountains when the moon was dark, collecting what they needed from the living and the dead. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those perfect circles of black earth and heard the clicking sounds Sarah had written about in her final entry. By morning, I'd made another decision. I was going back up that mountain, but this time I wouldn't go alone. Ranger Carlos Martinez arrived at dawn with 2 tracking dogs and enough equipment to outfit a small expedition. I'd worked with Carlos for 8 years. He was younger than me, with a wife and 2 kids in town, but he knew these mountains almost as well as I did. More importantly, he didn't ask stupid questions when I told him to bring extra batteries and emergency flares. "You look like hell, Danny," he said, loading his pack from the back of his truck. Didn't sleep much. I checked my gear one more time. Radio, GPS unit, first aid kit, emergency shelter, and the .38 service revolver I usually left in the truck. Today felt different. Today I wanted it close. The dogs were good stock. A German shepherd named Rex and a bloodhound called Molly. They'd found more lost hikers than any other team in the state forest system. But as we approached the students' campsite, both animals started acting strange. Rex began whining when we were still a quarter-mile away. By the time we reached the first bone circle, both dogs were practically crawling on their bellies, ears flat against their heads. "What's wrong with them?" Carlos asked, tugging on Molly's leash. "Same thing that's wrong with my compass," I said, showing him the spinning needle. Carlos checked his own gear. Same problems: dead GPS, stopped watch, electronics going haywire. But he was a practical man, trained to work through equipment failures. We broke out the topographic maps and oriented ourselves the old-fashioned way. "Let's give the dogs something to track," he said, pulling a plastic bag from his pack. Inside was a t-shirt that belonged to Sarah Chen, provided by her roommate. Molly sniffed the shirt and immediately began backing away, whimpering. Rex took 1 scent and laid down flat, refusing to move. "Never seen them do that before," Carlos said. His voice had changed, picking up the same edge of worry I'd been carrying since yesterday. We spent the morning expanding our search pattern, moving in careful grids away from the campsite. The bone circles were everywhere once you knew what to look for, dozens of them scattered across the mountainside like some kind of infection. Each one was identical, 6 feet across, perfectly round, filled with that black earth that seemed to absorb light. Around noon, we found the first real clue. Carlos spotted it first, a flash of color against the dark soil of one of the circles. Sarah's red baseball cap, half buried in the center of the disturbed earth. But when we dug it out, the cap was wrong. Too clean, for one thing, like it had been placed there instead of dropped. And there were scratches on the brim, deep gouges that looked almost like claw marks. "How does a hat end up buried in the middle of this?" Carlos asked. I didn't have an answer, but I was starting to develop some ugly theories. We kept searching. The afternoon brought more discoveries, each one worse than the last. Michael's hiking boot, found in another circle 200 yards away. David's wallet, emptied of everything except his student ID, discovered in a third circle near the old mine entrance. But it was what we found inside the mine that changed everything. The entrance was partially collapsed, blocked by decades of rockfall and rusted warning signs. But there was a gap between the fallen timbers, just wide enough for a person to squeeze through. Carlos shined his flashlight into the darkness beyond. "Jesus Christ," he whispered. The beam illuminated what looked like an underground cathedral made of bones. Human skulls formed archways leading deeper into the mountain. Rib cages were woven together like basketwork, creating walls that stretched beyond our light. Leg bones had been arranged in precise geometric patterns across the floor, forming pathways that led toward some unseen destination in the depths. And everything was old. Not just the mining equipment or the wooden supports. The bones themselves looked ancient, yellowed, and cracked with age. Some were so old they'd turned to dust, creating gray drifts in the corners where our flashlight beams couldn't reach. "How many people?" Carlos asked. I tried to count the skulls in just the first archway. Lost track around 30. A lot more than 3 college students. Carlos keyed his radio, trying to reach base camp. Static answered him, the same white noise that had plagued me yesterday. We were on our own up here, cut off from the outside world by whatever force was scrambling our electronics. That's when we heard the clicking. It started soft, like fingernails tapping on wood, but it was rhythmic, deliberate, coming from somewhere deep in the mine. Click, 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 pause, click, 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 like Morse code, or maybe like bones being assembled into new configurations. The dogs went crazy. Rex started howling, a sound I'd never heard from him before, high and desperate, like he was in pain. Molly tried to run, pulling so hard on her leash that Carlos had to use both hands to hold her. "We need to get out of here," Carlos said. I agreed, but as we turned to leave, I saw something that made my blood freeze. Fresh footprints in the dirt outside the mine entrance. Not hiking boots or work shoes, bare feet, but wrong somehow. Too long, with what looked like extra joints in the toes. And they were leading away from the mine, heading downhill toward town. "Carlos," I said, pointing at the tracks. He saw them too. His face went pale under his ranger's tan. "Those aren't human." We followed the tracks for maybe 50 yards before they disappeared into rocky ground. But I'd seen enough to know we were dealing with something beyond our training, beyond our equipment, beyond anything the Park Service had prepared us for. The sun was setting as we made our way back to the trucks. The temperature dropped with the light, turning our breath to frost clouds. But it wasn't just cold, it was wrong, like the warmth was being actively sucked out of the air around us. "What do we tell Mills?" Carlos asked as we loaded the dogs into his truck. Both animals were still shaking, pressed against each other, in the back seat. I thought about the Bone Cathedral, about the impossible footprints, about 3 college students who'd vanished without a trace. "We tell him we need more help, a lot more help." But as we drove down the mountain road, I kept checking my mirrors. The feeling of being watched, of being followed, settled over me like a cold blanket. Whatever lived in those mines, whatever had built that cathedral of bones, I was pretty sure it knew we'd been there, and I was starting to think it might be interested in adding to its collection. We returned the next morning with 6 additional rangers, a state police detective, and a forensics team from Richmond. I'd spent all night on the phone, calling in every favor I had, because something told me we were running out of time. Detective Ray Kowalski was a 15-year veteran who'd seen everything from drug murders to cult killings. But when we showed him the Bone Cathedral, I watched the color drain from his face. "How long has this been here?" he asked, playing his flashlight beam across the skull archways. "Could be decades," I said. "Maybe longer. Some of these bones look like they predate the mining operation." Kowalski nodded slowly. "We're going to need a bigger team. This is a crime scene that stretches back God knows how far." But before we could organize a proper investigation, things went sideways fast. It started with Ranger Pete Holloway. Pete was new, maybe 6 months on the job, eager to prove himself. He volunteered to map the outer perimeter while the rest of us worked the mine entrance. Good plan, standard procedure. Pete never came back. We found his radio first, crackling with static in the center of a fresh bone circle. The circle wasn't there the day before. I'd walked that exact spot during our grid search. But now the earth was torn up in that familiar pattern. Black soil scattered around Pete's equipment, like he'd just vanished in the middle of there. Transmitting. His last radio call was logged at 2:47 p.m. "Base, I'm seeing movement in the tree line. Something big. Looks like... Wait, that can't be right. Are you getting this?" Then nothing but static. Kowalski organized an immediate search pattern, putting every man we had into the field. But as afternoon shadows lengthened, it became clear we weren't hunting for Pete anymore. We were being hunted ourselves. The bone circles multiplied like cancer. Every hour brought new ones, appearing in areas we'd just searched. And they weren't random, they formed a pattern, a rough semicircle that seemed designed to drive us toward the mine entrance. "It's hurting us," said Ranger Tom Bradley, studying our map. Tom was a 20-year veteran, and I'd never seen him look scared before. "Whatever's doing this, it wants us in a specific place." At 4:15 p.m., we lost radio contact with the forensics team. They'd been working inside the mine, photographing the bone structures and taking samples. When we went looking for them, we found their equipment scattered outside the entrance like it had been thrown. But no bodies, no blood, just empty clothes arranged in neat piles beside 3 new bone circles. "That's it," Kowalski said. "We're pulling back to town, regrouping with federal backup." I agreed completely. But as we prepared to evacuate, the mountain made it clear we weren't leaving. The first skeleton assembled itself while we were loading gear into the trucks. I saw it happening in my peripheral vision. Individual bones rolling together like magnetized metal, clicking into place with that rhythmic sound Sarah had written about in her notebook. Leg bones socketed into hip joints, ribs curved into place around an empty chest cavity, skull balanced on vertebrae with hollow eye sockets that seemed to track our movement. The thing stood 12 feet tall when fully assembled, cobbled together from bones of different ages and species. Human. The skulls sat on animal ribcage. Bird bones formed delicate finger structures. Everything held together by some force I couldn't understand, animated by a hunger I could feel pressing against my mind like cold fingers. "Nobody move," I whispered. But Ranger Bradley panicked. He pulled his service weapon and put 3 rounds center mass into the skeleton. The bullets passed through empty air between ribs, sparking off rocks behind the creature. The skeleton turned its head toward Bradley with a grinding sound like millstones. It moved faster than anything that size should be able to move. One moment it was standing 30 feet away. The next it was on top of Bradley, those impossible hands wrapped around his throat. I heard bones breaking. Not the skeleton's bones, but Bradley's. The screaming stopped very quickly. "Run!" Kowalski shouted, but there was nowhere to go. More skeletons were assembling all around us, rising from bone circles we hadn't noticed in the failing light. Dozens of them, each one unique but equally impossible. They moved with coordinated purpose, cutting off escape routes, driving us exactly where the first one had indicated, toward the mine. We retreated fighting, but our weapons were useless. Bullets passed through empty spaces between bones. Fire extinguishers had no effect. Even when we managed to knock one apart with axes and crowbars, the bones just rolled back together within minutes. Carlos caught one in the chest with his emergency flare, the magnesium burning at 3,000 degrees. For a moment, I thought we'd found their weakness. The skeleton staggered backward, bones glowing red-hot. But then it just reassembled itself around the burning flare, incorporating the light into its structure like decoration. By the time we reached the mine entrance, only 4 of us were left. Me, Carlos, Kowalski, and a forensics tech named Dr. Sarah Vance. The skeletons had taken the others, not killing them outright, but dragging them away towards some purpose I didn't want to imagine. "Into the mine," Kowalski said. "It's defensible." I wanted to argue, but the bone creatures were closing in. We squeezed through the gap between fallen timbers into the cathedral of bones that now felt like sanctuary compared to what waited outside. Our flashlights revealed changes since yesterday. The bone structures had grown, expanding deeper into the mountain. New archways led to passages I hadn't seen before, and the clicking sounds were louder now, more urgent. "What are they building?" Dr. Vance asked, her voice barely a whisper. I had a terrible feeling I was about to find out. The clicking grew louder as we moved deeper into the mine, following bone pathways that seemed to pulse with their own light. Our flashlights revealed impossible architecture. Spiraling towers of ribs and vertebrae reaching up into darkness, bridges made of interwoven arm bones spanning underground chasms, entire rooms where the walls were, mosaics of human skulls arranged in hypnotic patterns. "This isn't random, Doctor," Vance said, running her hand along a section of wall. "There's intelligence here, purpose. Someone's been designing this for a very long time." The clicking stopped. In the sudden silence, we could hear something else. A sound like wind through empty bones, but rhythmic, deliberate. It took me a moment to realize what it was. Breathing. Something massive was breathing in the depths below us. "We need to leave," Carlos whispered, "right now." But when we turned back toward the entrance, Our way was blocked. A skeleton stood in the passage, but this one was different from the others. Older, more complete. It wore the tattered remains of what looked like Cherokee clothing, with bone ornaments and carved stones woven into its ribcage. When it spoke, its voice was like wind through a graveyard. "You have come to witness the awakening." Kowalski raised his gun, but I grabbed his wrist. "Don't. I think it wants to talk." The ancient skeleton tilted its head, empty sockets fixed on me. "You are wise for one so young." "Yes, we will speak. You will understand what you have interrupted." "Who are you?" I asked. "I am what remains of Standing Bear, last shaman of the Blackwater Cherokee. I died protecting this place from those who would steal the earth's bones for their machines. But death is not the end for guardians." The skeleton gestured to the bone cathedral around us. "For 200 years, I have gathered what was taken. Every bone disturbed by mining, every body desecrated by greed, every spirit displaced by your people's hunger for coal and gold. All return to where they belong." "The college students," Carlos said. "Where are they?" Standing Bear turned toward him. "They live. For now. But they have seen what sleeps beneath, and such knowledge cannot be allowed to spread. Soon they will join the others, willing guardians of the deep places." "What's down there?" "Doctor," Vance asked. Instead of answering, Standing Bear began walking deeper into the mine. After a moment, we followed. What choice did we have? The bone pathways led us down through chambers I never could have imagined. Rooms where thousands of skulls watched us from alcoves in the walls. Galleries where complete skeletons stood in silent ranks, waiting for some signal I couldn't understand. And everywhere, that rhythmic breathing grew stronger. Finally, we reached the heart of it all. The chamber was vast, carved from living rock, and older than the mines above. In the center, something impossible was taking shape. A skeleton the size of a building, assembled from bones gathered over centuries. Human remains mixed with those of animals long extinct, all held together by the same force that animated Standing Bear and his servants. But this wasn't just big, it was ancient, primordial. The skull alone was 20 feet across, with eye sockets like caves and teeth the size of tombstones. As we watched, smaller skeletons worked like ants, adding new bones to the structure, building towards some terrible completion. "The Bone King," Standing Bear said with something like reverence. "First guardian of the earth's depths, sleeping since the ice retreated. Your people's greed has finally gathered enough death to wake it." I saw them then, Sarah, Michael, and David, standing near the creature's feet. They were alive but changed, their eyes reflecting light like animals. When Sarah saw me, she smiled with too many teeth. "Ranger Ashford," she called out. "You came back, we hoped you would." "Sarah, we're here to help," I said, taking a step toward her. "Help?" She laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "We don't need help, we understand now. This is where we belong." The massive skull turned toward us, empty sockets fixing on our group with intelligence older than human civilization. When it spoke, its voice was the sound of continents shifting. "More builders come. Good. The work nears completion." Standing Bear bowed to the enormous creature. "Bone King, these are not willing servants. They resist the transformation. Then they will provide materials instead of labor." The smaller skeletons began moving toward us, clicking and scraping across the stone floor. But I noticed something. They avoided the areas where Carlos had dropped his emergency flares. Fire seemed to disrupt whatever force held them together. "The thermite flares," I whispered to Carlos. "Use them all." Carlos understood immediately. He pulled both remaining flares from his pack, arming them with shaking hands. "When I say run, you run for the entrance. Don't look back." "What about you?" I asked. "Someone needs to bring this place down." The skeletons were almost on us when Carlos triggered the first flare. Magnesium fire erupted in the chamber, blindingly bright and hot enough to melt steel. The bone creatures shrieked, a sound like breaking chalk magnified 1,000 times. Some of them simply fell apart, their animating force disrupted by the intense heat. "Run!" Carlos shouted, triggering the second flare. We ran, through passages of bone and stone, past galleries of watching skulls, up toward the distant promise of daylight. Behind us, the mountain shook as Carlos's remaining thermite charges detonated, bringing down support beams and collapsing tunnels. But the Bone King's roar followed us. a sound of rage and hunger that made the rock itself tremble. It was waking up, and our escape had only delayed the inevitable. We made it to the entrance just as the mine began collapsing in earnest. Kowalski and Dr. Vance squeezed through the gap first, then helped pull me through as stones rained down behind us. Carlos never made it out. The official report blamed the mine collapse on unstable geology and groundwater erosion. 7 people missing, presumed dead, in one of Virginia's worst cave-in disasters. The families got death certificates and insurance payouts. The area was sealed off with concrete barriers and federal warning signs. I transferred to Shenandoah National Park 3 months later. Couldn't handle the mountain views from my office anymore. Couldn't sleep when the wind sounded like clicking bones. Dr. Vance left forensics entirely, moved to Florida, and opened a beach hotel. Detective Kowalski retired early and moved his family to Arizona. None of us ever talked about what really happened in Blackwater Ridge. But I kept track. Geology surveys in the area consistently report unusual seismic activity. Hikers who ignore the barriers and venture onto the ridge often report hearing clicking sounds from underground. And every few months, park maintenance crews have to fill in fresh holes that appear overnight. Perfect circles of disturbed earth, 6 feet across. The Bone King is still down, there. Still gathering, still building towards some purpose I don't want to understand. 3 weeks ago, I got a call from a ranger in the Blue Ridge Mountains. They'd found bone circles near an abandoned copper mine, along with camping equipment belonging to a missing family from Richmond. The ranger wanted to know if I'd ever seen anything like it before. I told him to seal off the area and call in federal backup. I told him to bring thermite flares and stay away from the mine entrance. I told him everything I could without sounding completely insane. But I didn't tell him about the dreams I've been having lately. Dreams where I'm back in that bone cathedral, watching the massive skeleton complete its resurrection. Dreams where Sarah Chen smiles at me with too many teeth and asks when I'm coming home. Dreams where something vast and hungry calls my name from the deep places of the earth. So, if you're planning to hike in the Appalachians, especially around old mining country, watch out for perfect circles of disturbed soil. If you see them, turn around and leave immediately. Don't investigate, don't take pictures, don't think you can handle whatever made them. Because some things are older than human civilization, and they've been waiting a very long time for us to dig deep enough to wake them up. The mountain remembers everything we've taken from it, and someday it's going to want it all back. My name is Robert Grimsley, and I've been a forest ranger in West Virginia's Monongahela National Forest for 20 years. I've seen bears attack campers, found bodies after heart attacks on hiking trails, and pulled more than one fool out of a frozen creek. But nothing in 2 decades of service prepared me for what I found in Hunger Gap that January. It was 1969, and we were having the worst winter anyone could remember. Snow had been falling for 3 weeks straight, and the temperature hadn't gotten above 0 in 10 days. The radio weather service kept saying it was the coldest snap since 1899. Most of the park was closed to visitors, but that never stopped the adventurous ones from trying anyway. I live alone in a small cabin about 15 miles from the main ranger station. It's not much, just a bedroom, kitchen, and front room with a wood stove, but it suits me fine. I'd rather be out here than dealing with people all day. After Korea, I learned to appreciate quiet. That morning, the radio crackled to life around 7. It was Jim Patterson from the main station. "Bob, you there? We got a situation." I set down my coffee and picked up the handset. "What's going on, Jim?" "Got a report from some snowmobilers yesterday. They were up in Hunger Gap and found a cabin. Said there was something wrong with it. Real wrong. Hunger Gap was a valley about 20 miles deeper into the forest from my place. It got its name from an old story. Pioneers got trapped there during a bad winter back in 1847. Things got so desperate well, the story goes they did things people shouldn't do to survive. The local Cherokee always said that place was cursed after that." "What kind of wrong?" I asked. "They said they found bones, human bones, and signs that someone had been eating them." I felt my stomach turn. Could be an old burial site. You know how those hills are. "That's what I thought too, but these boys seemed pretty shook up." Said the bones looked fresh. And there were 3 snowmobiles parked outside the cabin, but no sign of the riders. I knew I had to check it out. Missing persons in winter weather meant we had maybe hours before hypothermia or exposure killed them. I'd seen what a West Virginia winter could do to someone caught unprepared. "I'll head up there," I said. "Give me the coordinates." Jim read off the location, and I plotted it on my map. It was a good day's travel on snowshoes, maybe 2 if the weather got worse. The forecast called for more snow starting around noon. I packed my emergency gear, rope, first aid kit, emergency food, flares, and my .30-06 rifle. In 20 years, I'd only had to use the rifle twice, both times on sick bears. But something about this call made me want it along. The hike started easy enough. The snow was deep but packed, and my snowshoes bit into it well. The forest was beautiful in its own harsh way. Tall oaks and maples standing bare against the gray sky, their branches heavy with snow. Everything was quiet except for the sound of my breathing and the soft crunch of my steps. But as I got deeper into the woods, heading toward Hunger Gap, I started noticing things that bothered me. There were no bird sounds, no squirrel chatter, no tracks from deer or rabbits. It was like every living thing had decided to stay away from this part of the forest. Around noon, the snow started falling again, just like the forecast said. Big, heavy flakes that stuck to everything and made it hard to see more than 50 yards ahead. I pulled my hood up and kept walking. That's when I started smelling something on the wind. Something sweet and rotten, like meat that had gone bad. At first I thought maybe it was just a dead deer. But as I got closer to Hunger Gap, the smell got stronger. By 3 in the afternoon, I could see the cabin through the trees. It was an old logging cabin, the kind they built back in the 1922. Sturdy logs, stone chimney, small windows. There were indeed 3 snowmobiles parked out front, covered in fresh snow. But something was very wrong with the scene. The snow around the cabin was all churned up and stained with dark patches. The front door was hanging open, swaying in the wind. And that smell, that awful sweet smell of rotting meat, was so strong now I had to breathe through my mouth. I approached slowly, my rifle ready. "Hello," I called out. "Forest Service? Anyone in there?" No answer. Just the wind and the creak of the hanging door. I walked up to the first snowmobile and brushed the snow off the seat. The engine was cold, hadn't been running for at least a day, maybe 2. Same with the other 2 machines. That's when I saw the first bone. It was lying in the snow about 10 feet from the cabin door. White and clean, like something had sucked all the meat off it. It was definitely human, although man, looked like part of a leg bone. My hands started shaking, and it wasn't from the cold. I stood there staring at that bone for a long time, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. In 20 years of ranger work, I'd found plenty of human remains. Hikers who fell off cliffs, hunters who had heart attacks, people who just got lost and died of exposure. But those bones were always scattered by animals or weathered by time. This bone was clean and white, like it had been carefully stripped of meat. I forced myself to look around more carefully. There were more bones scattered in the snow, ribs, what looked like pieces of arms, and something that might have been part of a skull. All of them picked clean. I pulled out my radio and tried to call the main station, but I was too far out and the mountains were blocking the signal. I'd have to get closer to high ground to make contact. The cabin door kept swaying in the wind, making a creaking sound that set my teeth on edge. I knew I had to go inside, but every instinct I had was telling me to get out of there as fast as possible. I walked up to the door and pushed it open all the way. The smell that hit me nearly knocked me over. It was like walking into a slaughterhouse that had been closed up for a week in summer heat. The inside of the cabin was a nightmare, bones everywhere, piled in corners, scattered across the floor, hanging from hooks on the walls like someone had been storing them. Some still had bits of frozen meat clinging to them. There were 3 sleeping bags laid out on the floor, but they were shredded and soaked with dark stains. In the center of the room was a fire pit made of stones, and in the pit were the charred remains of what looked like human bones. Someone had been cooking them. I backed out of the cabin and threw up in the snow. When I could think straight again, I tried to piece together what had happened. 3 snowmobilers had come up here, probably looking for adventure. Maybe they'd gotten trapped by the weather, and no. I'd seen desperate people before. I'd seen what starvation could do. But this wasn't desperation. This was something else. The bones were too clean, too carefully arranged. And there was something about the way they were piled that reminded me of pictures I'd seen in National Geographic and animals. The way certain animals store food for later. I was backing away from the cabin when I heard it. A voice calling from the woods. Faint and distant, but definitely human. "Help," it called. "Please, someone help me." My heart jumped. Maybe one of the snowmobilers had escaped. Maybe they were hiding in the woods, hurt and scared. I cupped my hands around my mouth. "Where are you? Keep calling." "Over here." The voice came back. It sounded like it was coming from deeper in the valley, past the cabin. "I'm hurt, please." I shouldered my rifle and started toward the voice, following what looked like a trail through the snow. The voice kept calling, always seeming to be just a little farther ahead. "I can't move," it called. "My leg's broken." The trail led down into the valley, through thick stands of bare trees. The snow was deeper here, and I had to work hard to keep up. But I kept following the voice. After about 20 minutes, I stopped to catch my breath and listen. The voice was still calling, but now it sounded different. Farther away, and there was something about it that made the hair on my neck stand up. It was the same voice, exactly the same voice. Same words, same tone, same desperate sound. But it had been calling for 20 minutes without getting tired or changing what it was saying. Real people don't talk like that. I stood very still and listened more carefully. The voice was calling again. "Help, please, someone help me." But now I could hear something else underneath it. A kind of echo, like the voice was being played back from a recording. And behind that echo I could hear something else. Something that sounded like breathing, but too deep and too slow to be human. "Over here, I'm hurt, please." The voice was closer now. Much closer. But I couldn't see anyone through the trees. That's when I noticed the tracks. They were in the snow right next to where I was standing. Footprints, but wrong. Too long and too narrow, with what looked like claw marks at the ends. And they were huge, bigger than any human foot I'd ever seen. The tracks led right up to where I was standing, then veered off into the trees toward where the voice was calling. My hands were shaking as I raised my rifle. Whatever was making that voice, it wasn't human. And it was hunting me. "I can't move. My leg's broken." The voice was coming from a thick stand of pine trees about 50 yards away. I could see something moving in the shadows between the trunks, but I couldn't make out what it was. I started backing away, trying to keep my rifle pointed toward the trees. That's when I heard a new sound. A low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The voice stopped calling. The forest went completely silent. And then something stepped out from behind the trees. It was tall, taller than any person had a right to be. Maybe 8 feet, maybe more. It was hard to tell because it was hunched over, like it was too tall for its own body. It was thin, so thin I could see its ribs through pale gray skin. Its arms hung down almost to the ground, ending in hands with fingers that looked more like claws. But the worst part was its face. It had human features, but stretched and wrong. Its mouth was too wide, filled with teeth that were too long and too sharp. Its eyes were yellow, like a cat's eyes, and they were looking right at me. "Help," it said in that same desperate voice. "Please, someone help me." But its mouth wasn't moving. I raised my rifle and fired. The creature jerked back like I'd hit it, but it didn't fall. Instead, it let out a sound I'll never forget, part scream, part howl, part something else that shouldn't come from any living thing. Then it turned and ran into the woods, moving faster than anything that size should be able to move. I stood there shaking for a long time, staring at the trees where it had disappeared. In the snow where it had been standing, there was a dark stain that looked like blood. But when I went to look at it more closely, the blood was already freezing, turning black in the cold air. I had to get out of there. I ran back toward the cabin as fast as the snowshoes would let me, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Behind me, I could hear something crashing through the trees, keeping pace but staying out of sight. Every few minutes, I'd hear that voice again. "Help, please, someone help me." But now I knew what it was. That thing had heard someone calling for help, maybe one of the snowmobilers, and now it was using their voice like a recording to lure more people. When I got back to the cabin, I stopped to catch my breath and think. The smart thing would be to get on one of the snowmobiles and get out of there as fast as possible. But when I checked the machines, I found that something had torn out the engine wires. All 3 of them were destroyed. I was trapped. The snow was falling harder now, and the wind was picking up. I could barely see 20 feet in any direction. I had maybe 2 hours of daylight left, and then I'd be stuck in these woods overnight with that thing. I tried my radio again, but still couldn't get through. I was too deep in the valley, surrounded by hills that blocked the signal. That's when I heard voices. Multiple voices, calling from different directions in the woods around the cabin. "Bob Grimsley, where are you?" That was Jim Patterson's voice from the ranger station. "Help us, we're lost." A woman's voice I didn't recognize. "Over here, I found something." A man's voice, also unfamiliar. But I knew none of them were real. That thing, whatever it was using the voices of people it had heard before. People it had killed. I ducked back into the cabin, even though the smell made me gag. It was the only shelter I had. I pushed the door shut and looked around for something to block it with. There was an old wooden table I could barely move, but I managed to drag it in front of the door. The voices kept calling from outside, sometimes close, sometimes far away. The thing was circling the cabin, testing me, trying to get me to come out. As it got darker, I built a fire in the fireplace. I had to clear out the human bones first, and the smell when I moved them nearly made me sick again. But I needed light and warmth if I was going to survive the night. Around midnight, the voices stopped. The forest went completely quiet again, except for the wind and the crackling of my fire. I sat with my back against the wall, rifle across my knees, trying to stay awake. That's when I heard the sound on the roof. Slow, deliberate footsteps, moving from one end of the cabin to the other. The thing was up there, probably looking for another way in. I heard scratching sounds, like claws digging into wood. Then a piece of the roof fell into the fire, sending up a shower of sparks. I looked up and saw something that made my blood freeze. 2 yellow eyes, staring down at me through a hole in the roof. I raised my rifle and fired. The eyes disappeared, and I heard that awful howling sound again, but farther away. A few seconds later, I heard something hit the ground outside. It had jumped down from the roof. Then the scratching started on the walls. It was testing the cabin, looking for weak spots. I could hear it moving around the outside, scratching at the logs, pushing against the windows. The small windows were boarded up on the outside, but I could hear the boards creaking under pressure. Around 3 in the morning, one of the window boards gave way. I saw a long, pale arm reach through the opening, feeling around for the window latch. The fingers were wrong, too long, with black claws instead of fingernails. I grabbed a burning piece of wood from the fire and jabbed it at the arm. The thing jerked back with another howl, and I smelled burning flesh. But it didn't give up. For the rest of the night, it kept trying different ways to get in. Sometimes it would scratch at the door. Sometimes it would test the other windows. Once, I heard it on the roof again, and another piece fell into the fire. But the worst part was the voices. All night long, it called to me in different voices. Jim Patterson, my ex-wife Sarah, my brother Mike, who died in Korea. Even my father, who'd been dead for 15 years. Bobby. It called in my father's voice. "Bobby, open the door. It's cold out here." "Bob, this is Jim. I'm here to help. Open up." Robert, in Sarah's voice. I came back. "I'm sorry I left. Please let me in." I knew none of it was real, but hearing those voices, especially my father's and my brother's, nearly broke me. There were times I almost opened the door, just to make it stop. But I held on. When dawn finally came, the voices stopped and the scratching stopped. I waited until I could see sunlight through the cracks around the door before I moved the table and looked outside. The snow around the cabin was all torn up, like something big had been pacing around it all night. I could see the tracks going off into the woods in multiple directions, like the thing had been running back and forth, getting more and more frustrated. But what really scared me was what I saw near the tree line. Bones. Fresh bones. Arranged in a pattern like some kind of warning or message. The thing wasn't just hunting me. It was playing with me. I knew I had to get out of there before nightfall, or I wouldn't survive another night. I spent the morning trying to figure out how to get out of Hunger Gap alive. The snowmobiles were useless, and I was too far from any road to walk out before dark. My only chance was to get to higher ground where I could use my radio to call for help. There was a ridge about 2 miles east of the cabin that might work. It would be a hard climb in the deep snow, but if I could get a signal through, a helicopter could pick me up. I packed what I could carry: some food, my rifle, ammunition, and emergency flares. The flares might come in handy if I had to signal for help or defend myself. Before I left the cabin, I took one more look at those bones arranged near the tree line. Now that I could see them in daylight, I realized they formed a shape. It looked almost like an arrow pointing deeper into the valley. The thing was trying to direct me somewhere, but why? I started toward the ridge, staying alert for any sign of the creature. The forest was still unnaturally quiet. No birds, no small animals, nothing. Just the sound of wind in the bare trees and my snowshoes crunching through the snow. About halfway to the ridge, I found them. 4 more bodies, or what was left of them. They were partially buried in the snow, arranged in a circle around what looked like a crude camp. These weren't the snowmobilers. This was an older scene. Maybe hunters who'd gotten trapped up here weeks or months ago. But like the bones at the cabin, these bodies had been carefully stripped of meat. And they'd been arranged deliberately, like some kind of offering or display. That's when I understood what I was dealing with. I'd heard stories about the Wendigo from some of the older Cherokee who still lived near the park. They said it was a creature born from cannibalism and starvation. Something that had once been human but had been transformed by the act of eating human flesh. It was always hungry, always hunting, and it grew stronger with each person it consumed. The story said that once someone became a Wendigo, they could never be satisfied. They would eat and eat, but the hunger would only get worse. They would grow larger and stronger, but also more desperate and more vicious. And they could mimic the voices of their victims. I was looking at the arranged bodies when I heard my own voice calling from the woods behind me. "Hello, Forest Service. Anyone in there?" It was exactly what I'd called out when I first approached the cabin yesterday. The thing had been watching me, learning from me. "Hello," my own voice called again. "Forest Service." I turned and saw it moving through the trees toward me. In daylight, it looked even worse than it had the night before. It was definitely larger than when I'd first seen it. Maybe 9 feet tall now, and broader through the shoulders. Its skin was pale gray, stretched tight over visible ribs and joints. Its face was a nightmare version of something that might once have been human. But the worst part was that it was smiling. It had learned that the voices brought prey to it, and it was happy with its hunting method. "Forest Service." It called in my voice, still smiling that horrible smile. "Anyone in there?" I raised my rifle and fired. The bullet hit it in the chest, and I saw dark blood spray from the wound, but it barely slowed down. It came at me fast, covering the distance between us in long, loping strides. I fired again and again, hitting it each time but not stopping it. When it was close enough, it swung one of those long arms at me. I dove to the side, and its claws raked across a tree trunk, leaving deep gouges in the bark. I rolled in the snow and came up running, heading for the ridge as fast as I could move. Behind me, I could hear it following, crashing through the underbrush and making that awful howling sound. The climb up the ridge was the hardest thing I'd ever done. The snow was waist-deep in places, and I had to use my hands to pull myself up the steeper sections. Behind me, the creature was gaining ground, moving through the snow like it weighed nothing. Halfway up the ridge, I found a small clearing where I could see back down the slope. The Wendigo was about 100 yards behind me, but it had stopped. It was standing at the edge of the tree line, looking up at me. And it was growing. I could see it happening in real time. It was getting taller, broader, more muscular. The bullet wounds were healing, the dark blood flow stopping. It was feeding on something, maybe just the hunt itself, or the fear it was causing. I pulled out my radio and tried to call for help. Static. I climbed higher. When I reached the top of the ridge, I finally got a signal. "Jim! Jim! This is Bob. Emergency." "Bob, where the hell are you? We've been trying to reach you all night." "Hunger Gap. I need immediate helicopter evacuation. There's something up here. Some kind of animal. It's killed at least 7 people." "Bob, slow down. What kind of animal?" I looked back down the ridge. The Wendigo had started climbing, moving up the slope with inhuman speed and grace. "Just send the helicopter. Now. I'm on the ridge east of the cabin." "Bob, there's a blizzard moving in. We can't fly in this weather." I looked at the sky. Dark clouds were building to the west, and the wind was picking up. Snow was starting to fall again. How long until it passes? Maybe 6 hours. Maybe more. The Wendigo was halfway up the ridge now. I don't have 6 hours. I clicked off the radio and looked around desperately. There had to be something I could do, some way to stop this thing. That's when I remembered the stories. The Cherokee elders said fire was the only thing that could really hurt a Wendigo. Not just any fire. It had to be a sacred fire. A cleansing fire. I thought about those emergency flares in my pack. They burned hot and bright, hot enough to start a fire even in wet conditions. The Wendigo was only 50 yards away now, close enough that I could see its yellow eyes and that terrible smile. I pulled out a flare and struck it. It burst into brilliant red light, hissing and sparking. The Wendigo stopped, shielding its eyes from the bright flame. It was afraid of the fire. I lit 2 more flares and threw them down the slope toward the creature. Where they landed, the snow hissed and melted, and the Wendigo backed away, making that howling sound. But I only had 6 flares total. That wasn't enough to keep it away for long. Then I had an idea. The Wendigo was afraid of fire, but I needed more than just flares. I needed to destroy whatever was feeding it, whatever was making it stronger. I thought about what I'd seen, the arranged bones, the carefully stored remains, the way it had been building some kind of collection. This wasn't just random hunting, it was creating a feeding ground, a place where it could store food and grow stronger. The cabin. That was its nest, its base. If I could burn that down, maybe I could weaken it enough to escape. I lit another flare and started working my way down the backside of the ridge, away from the Wendigo. The snow was coming down harder now, which would help hide my movement, but also make everything more dangerous. It took me 2 hours to circle back to the cabin area. By then, the blizzard was in full force. I could barely see 20 feet in any direction, but that also meant the Wendigo couldn't see me coming. I could hear it calling from somewhere in the storm, sometimes in my voice, sometimes in the voices of its other victims. It was hunting for me, moving through the woods, getting more frustrated as the storm made tracking harder. I made it to the cabin and quickly gathered anything that would burn: broken furniture, old papers, dry wood from a pile outside. I soaked it all with lamp oil I found in a cupboard. Then I lit my last 3 flares and threw them into the pile. The cabin went up like it was made of matchsticks. The flames spread so fast I barely got out in time. Within minutes, the whole structure was engulfed, and the fire was spreading to the trees around it. That's when I heard the Wendigo scream. It wasn't the howling sound I'd heard before. This was different, a sound of pure rage and pain, like something vital had been torn away from it. Through the falling snow, I could see it running toward the burning cabin, its yellow eyes reflecting the flames. It tried to get close to the fire, but the heat and light drove it back. It circled the burning building, making that screaming sound, getting more desperate as its feeding ground was destroyed. And then something amazing happened. The Wendigo started getting smaller. I could see it shrinking, losing the height and bulk it had gained. The pale gray skin began to darken and crack. The yellow eyes dimmed. Whatever power it had been drawing from that place, from those stored remains, was being burned away with the cabin. But it wasn't dead. Even weakened, it was still dangerous, still hunting. I started moving through the storm, trying to get to higher ground where the helicopter might be able to find me when the weather cleared. Behind me, I could hear the Wendigo following, but it was moving slower now, less sure of itself. The blizzard lasted until dawn. When the snow finally stopped and the sun came out, I was huddled under a rock overhang about 3 miles from where the cabin had been. I could see smoke still rising from that direction. I tried my radio again and got through to Jim immediately. "Bob, thank God, where are you?" I gave him my coordinates, and 20 minutes later I heard the beautiful sound of helicopter rotors. They pulled me up on a rope and flew me back to the main station. I told them I'd found evidence of cannibalism in the cabin and that there was a dangerous animal in the area, probably a bear driven mad by hunger. They sent a team back to investigate, but all they found were the burned remains of the cabin and a lot of scattered bones that they assumed were old Native American burial remains. They never found any sign of the Wendigo, but I know it's still out there. 3 months later, I heard about some hikers who went missing in a different part of the forest. The search team found their camp, but no sign of the hikers themselves, just some gnawed bones and evidence that someone had been cooking meat over a fire. And last week, Jim told me about a strange report from some campers. They said they heard voices calling for help in the woods near Hunger Gap, but when they went to investigate, They couldn't find anyone. The voices were using the campers' own names, calling them deeper into the forest. I put in for early retirement last month. After 20 years in these woods, I think I've seen enough. But sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind is blowing through the trees, I still hear voices calling from the darkness. Familiar voices, asking for help. And I know that somewhere out there in the Monongahela National Forest, something is still hungry. Something that will never be satisfied. My name is James Hawthorne, and I've been a park ranger for 14 years. I tell people that because I need them to believe what I'm about to tell you really happened. I know how crazy it sounds, but I swear on my life every word is true. Back in September 1975, I was working at New River Gorge in West Virginia. My job was watching birds, specifically the big ones like hawks and eagles that migrated through our area. I had my degree in wildlife biology, and I thought I knew everything about flying creatures. I was wrong. Devil's Den Overlook was my favorite spot. It sits on these massive sandstone cliffs about 400 feet above the New River. The thermals rising from the gorge made it perfect for watching raptors. Plus, it was quiet. The nearest town was Point Pleasant, 22 miles away through winding mountain roads. Most days, I had the place to myself. I'd been married to Sarah for 8 months. She was my second wife. My first marriage didn't survive the long hours and isolation of ranger work. Sarah was different. She understood that sometimes I had to spend nights in the field, setting up equipment or tracking animal movements. She even packed my thermos with coffee and those little sandwiches I liked. The old quarry sat about half a mile from the overlook. They'd pulled limestone out of there back in the 1950 seconds until 3 workers died in a cave-in. After that, the company just walked away, left behind rusted equipment, flooded pits, and a maze of tunnels that went deep into the cliff face. Local kids sometimes hiked up there to drink beer and scare each other with ghost stories. That September was unusually stormy. Electrical storms rolled through almost every evening, making the wildlife nervous. I'd noticed changes in animal behavior. Deer avoiding certain areas, dogs in town howling at night, even the birds seemed agitated. My scientific mind said it was just the weather patterns, but something felt off. The first report came from a Startney rock climber named Tommy Morrison. He stumbled into my ranger station around noon on September 15th, white as a sheet and shaking like a leaf. "There's something up there," he kept saying, pointing toward Devil's Den. "Something big, with eyes like headlights." Tommy was a good climber, been scaling those cliffs for years. He wasn't the type to spook easily, but when I asked him to describe what he saw, his story didn't make sense. "It was perched on the cliff edge like a bird," he said, "but it was huge, maybe 8 feet tall when it stood up, had wings that stretched wider than my truck, and those eyes." He shuddered. Red eyes that glowed like brake lights in the dark. I wrote it up as a possible bear sighting. Black bears sometimes stood on their hind legs, and in poor light, shadows could play tricks on you. The glowing eyes were probably just reflected light. I'd seen dozens of similar reports over the years, usually turned out to be owls or deer or someone's imagination running wild. But then Mrs. Patterson called from the grocery store in town. 3 more people had come in talking about the same thing. A postal worker driving the mountain route, a hunter checking his tree stands, even old Bill Cassidy, who'd lived in those hills his whole life and knew every animal in the forest. "They're all saying the same thing, James," Mrs. Patterson told me over the crackling phone line. "Something with wings and red eyes, bigger than any bird they ever seen." I promised to investigate. Part of me was curious from a scientific standpoint. If there was an unusual animal in the area, it was my job to identify and document it. Maybe an injured bird, disoriented and acting strangely. Or possibly someone was hoaxing the whole thing, trying to create their own local legend. I packed my gear that evening: camera with telephoto lens, binoculars, notebook, flashlight, and my .38 service revolver. The gun was standard equipment, mainly for protection against bears or the occasional drunk hunter. I never imagined I might need it for something else. The hike to Devil's Den took about an hour in daylight. The trail wound through thick forest before opening onto the rocky overlook. I arrived just as the sun was setting, painting the gorge in shades of orange and purple. Below me, the new river curved like a dark ribbon through the valley. I set up my equipment and waited. The air was still, heavy with the promise of another storm. In the distance, thunder rumbled like an old dog growling in its sleep. Perfect conditions for confused wildlife, I thought. Around 9 p.m., I heard the first sound. A low whooshing noise, like wind through a tunnel. But there was no wind. The leaves on the trees hung motionless in the humid air. Then I saw the shadow. It passed over me fast, blocking out a patch of stars for just a moment. Too big to be a bird, too quiet to be a plane. My heart started beating faster, but I told myself to stay calm. Probably just a cloud, or maybe a large bat. The shadow came back, circling the overlook in wide arcs. Each time it passed overhead, I tried to get a better look, but it stayed just outside the range of my flashlight. All I could make out was something dark against the darker sky, moving with the fluid grace of a natural flyer. On the fourth pass, I saw the eyes. 2 red dots in the darkness, maybe 30 feet above me. They didn't reflect my flashlight beam like animal eyes should. Instead, they seemed to glow with their own inner fire, steady and unblinking. I fumbled for my camera, but by the time I got it ready, the thing was gone. The woods fell silent, except for the distant rumble of approaching thunder. I stayed on that cliff until dawn, but I didn't see it again. When I hiked back to my truck, I found scratches in the dirt near where I'd been sitting. Deep gouges, like claw marks, but too big to be from any bird I knew. Driving home, I convinced myself I'd seen something ordinary. A plane with unusual lights, a weather balloon, maybe even someone playing an elaborate prank with some kind of flying machine. But deep down, I knew I was lying to myself. Whatever I'd seen up there wasn't natural, and for the first time in my 14 years as a ranger, I was scared. The next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about those red eyes. I went to the library in Point Pleasant and read everything I could find about unusual animal sightings in West Virginia. Most of it was folklore, stories about phantom panthers and devil dogs that local families had been telling for generations. But I did find something interesting. The Cherokee who lived in this area before white settlers arrived had stories about a creature they called the Messenger of Doom. According to their legends, it appeared before great disasters, trying to warn people of coming tragedy. They described it as a giant moth-like being with glowing red eyes. Old legends, I told myself. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd stumbled onto something real. I decided to set up a proper observation post. If this thing was real, and if it was following some kind of pattern, I might be able to document it properly. I selected a spot about 200 yards from the overlook, hidden in a grove of pine trees where I could watch the area without being seen. On September 18th, I hiked up with more equipment, a motion-activated camera, a tape recorder, even a thermometer to track temperature changes. I'd read that some people reported feeling intense cold before supernatural encounters. Scientific method, I reminded myself. Document everything. I was settling into my hiding spot when I heard voices echoing from the old quarry. 2 male voices, laughing and talking loud. Probably teenagers drinking beer and looking for trouble. I considered going over to run them off. The quarry was dangerous, especially at night, but decided to wait. If the creature showed up, I didn't want witnesses around to complicate things. Around 10 p.m., the voices went quiet. Then I heard a scream. Not the playful scream of kids trying to scare each other. This was pure terror. The sound a person makes when they know they're about to die. I grabbed my flashlight and ran toward the quarry. The old access road was overgrown with weeds and littered with rusted equipment. I stumbled over cables and chunks of broken concrete, following the screaming. When I reached the main pit, I found one kid, maybe 16 years old, pressed against the chain-link fence that surrounded the flooded quarry. His face was pale with shock, and he was pointing at something in the water. "He fell," the kid gasped when he saw me. "Tommy fell in. Something grabbed him." I shined my light across the black water. About 30 feet from shore, I could see someone thrashing around, going under and coming back up, coughing and choking. "Stay here," I shouted to the kid, then started looking for a way down to the water. The quarry walls were almost vertical, cut smooth by the mining operation. But there was an old wooden ladder, half rotted but still attached to the rock face. I climbed down as fast as I dared, The water was deeper than it looked. My boots couldn't touch bottom even close to shore. I'm a decent swimmer, but in the dark, with my clothes and boots on, it was hard going. I reached Tommy just as he was going under again. He was hurt bad. I could feel blood on his scalp where I grabbed him, and his left arm hung at a weird angle. Probably hit the rocks when he fell. Getting him back to shore was the hardest thing I'd ever done. He kept passing out, and the quarry walls were too steep to climb with an injured person. Finally, I found a spot where fallen rocks had created a rough ramp. I half-carried, half-dragged Tommy up to level ground. The kid who'd been with him was gone, just vanished. I didn't blame him. He was probably scared out of his mind. I got Tommy to my truck and drove him to the hospital in Point Pleasant. He had a concussion, a broken arm, and several deep cuts from the rocks. The doctor said he was lucky to be alive. When he was feeling better, I asked him what happened. "We were just messing around," he said, his voice still shaky, "looking for bats in the quarry." Then Jimmy said he saw something big flying overhead. We looked up, and there it was. There what was? This huge thing with wings, like a giant bat but wrong somehow. It had a human face but covered with fur or feathers. And those eyes. He shuddered. Red eyes that looked right through you. According to Tommy, the creature had swooped down at them. Jimmy panicked and ran, but Tommy tripped and fell backward off the quarry edge. He was lucky the water was deep enough to break his fall, or he would have died hitting the rocks. "It saved my life," Tommy said quietly. "That thing, whatever it was, I went under and thought I was drowning, but something pushed me back to the surface. Something with claws, but gentle claws. Like it was trying to help." I wrote up the incident as an accidental fall. In my official report, I mentioned that the victim claimed to see a large bird, possibly an owl, which may have startled him. I didn't mention the red eyes or the human face. That kind of detail would have gotten me transferred to a desk job. But privately, I was starting to believe this thing was real. And if Tommy was right, it wasn't necessarily hostile. Dangerous, maybe, but not evil. I decided to go back to Devil's Den the next night. This time, I was going to be ready. I brought a better camera with infrared film, a powerful spotlight, and my service revolver. I also brought something else, a small tape recorder loaded with bird calls. If this creature was attracted to certain sounds, maybe I could lure it in for a better look. The weather was perfect. Clear sky, no wind, good visibility. I set up my equipment on the overlook and waited. At 11:15 p.m., my motion detector went off. Something was moving through the trees below me, something big enough to trigger the sensor from 50 yards away. I turned on my tape recorder and started playing hawk calls, then eagle cries, then owl hoots. The response was immediate. A sound unlike anything I'd ever heard, part bird call, part human voice, like someone trying to sing but unable to remember the words. It came from directly above me. I looked up and saw it clearly for the first time. The creature perched on a dead tree about 20 feet over my head. It was huge, easily 8 feet tall with wings that stretched at least 12 feet from tip to tip. The body was humanoid but covered in dark feathers or fur. The head was the worst part. Almost human, but with enormous black eyes that reflected my flashlight beam like mirrors. And above those black eyes, 2 smaller red ones that glowed with their own light. It watched me for maybe 10 seconds, tilting its head like a curious bird. Then it opened its mouth and made that sound again, that haunting musical cry that raised goosebumps on my arms. I managed to take 3 photographs before it spread its wings and launched itself into the air. It didn't flap like a bird. Instead, it seemed to glide on invisible currents, moving with impossible grace for something so large. I followed it with my spotlight as it circled the overlook. On the second pass, it came lower, maybe 10 feet above my head, close enough that I could see details I wish I hadn't. The creature's claws were like human hands, but elongated and ending in sharp points. Its chest rose and fell like it was breathing hard. And its eyes, those 4 eyes, never stopped watching me. On the third pass, something extraordinary happened. The creature hovered directly in front of me, wings beating slowly too. Maintain position. Then it spoke. Not with its mouth, but directly into my mind. I heard words as clearly as if someone was standing next to me, but the creature's mouth never moved. "Danger comes," the voice said. "Many will die. The bridge will fall." Before I could react, The creature shot straight up into the night sky and vanished. I stood there for a long time, trying to process what had just happened. A giant moth-like creature had just delivered what sounded like a prophecy directly into my brain. Either I was losing my mind, or I'd just made contact with something beyond human understanding. When I developed the photographs the next day, 2 of them showed nothing but empty sky. But the third one was clear enough to make me believe my own eyes. The creature was real, and it had a message. Word spread fast through Point Pleasant about the thing at Devil's Den. By the end of September, I was getting calls from reporters, cryptozoologists, and curiosity seekers wanting to know about the Mothman sightings. That's what they started calling it, the Mothman. I tried to play it down, sticking to my official reports about misidentified birds and teenage pranks. But privately, I kept going back to the creature's message. The bridge will fall. Point Pleasant had 2 major bridges. The older one was the Silver Bridge, built in 1928, that carried Route 35 across the Ohio River. The newer bridge was about 5 miles downstream. If something was going to happen to one of them, I figured it would be the Silver Bridge. That old suspension bridge carried thousands of cars every day, and it was showing its age. I started paying attention to the bridge during my trips to town, looking for cracks in the concrete, rust on the cables, anything that might suggest structural problems. But I'm a wildlife biologist, not an engineer. I wouldn't know a dangerous flaw if it bit me. The sightings continued almost every night, not just at Devil's Den, but all around the Point Pleasant area. A farmer named Newell Partridge saw the creature in his barn, standing over his dog. The dog was dead when he found it the next morning, no marks on it, like it had died of fright. Linda Scarberry and her husband Roger were driving near the old munitions plant when they saw it in their headlights. According to Linda, it followed their car for 2 miles, keeping pace at 100 miles per hour. When they got home, their car radio was full of static, and their dog spent the night hiding under the porch. Each witness described the same thing: enormous size, glowing red eyes, and an overwhelming sense of dread. Some people reported hearing that strange musical cry. Others said it communicated telepathically, always with warnings about coming disaster. I started keeping a detailed log of every sighting, trying to find patterns. The creature appeared most often on clear nights with low humidity. It seemed drawn to electrical equipment. Several witnesses reported their car radios going haywire. And it was always alone. Whatever this thing was, there was only one of them. On October 12th, I had my second direct encounter. I was hiking back from a raptor count in the northern section of the park when I heard equipment running in the old quarry. Heavy machinery, like bulldozers or excavators. That was strange. The quarry had been abandoned for 20 years. I climbed up to investigate and found 3 men with a small excavator digging near the flooded pit. They had permits from the county, something about soil testing for a possible development project. The crew chief, a guy named Bill Hendricks, explained they were taking core samples to see if the land could support new construction. Just be careful around the water, I warned him. Those quarry walls are unstable, and the water's deeper than it looks. Bill nodded and went back to work. I was about to leave when the motion detector I'd left, hidden in the trees, started beeping. Something big was moving through the forest. I told the work crew to shut down their equipment and listen. At first, all we could hear was the normal sounds of evening in the woods: crickets, a distant owl, leaves rustling in the breeze. Then we heard the cry. That haunting, musical sound echoing off the quarry walls. "What the hell was that?" one of the workers asked. Before I could answer, we saw it. The Mothman rose from the tree line like a shadow gaining substance, wings spread wide against the darkening sky. It circled the quarry once, then landed on the arm of the excavator. The 3 workers just stood there, frozen. I don't think they could believe what they were seeing. The creature was even bigger than I remembered, easily 8 feet tall, with those 4 eyes glowing in the gathering darkness. It looked directly at Bill Hendricks and tilted its head. Then, just like before, I heard its voice in my mind. "Death waits below. Do not dig deeper." Bill obviously couldn't hear the mental communication, but he could see the creature well enough. He started backing away from the excavator, his face white with terror. The Mothman spread its wings and let out another cry, louder this time. Then it launched itself into the air and disappeared over the tree line. "Did you guys see that?" Bill whispered. We all nodded. There was no point denying it. "I think we're done here for today," Bill said, and started packing up his equipment. I helped them load their gear, hoping that would be the end of it. But as they were driving away, Bill stopped his truck next to me. "Ranger Hawthorne," he said through the window. "I've been working construction for 25 years. I've never seen anything like that in my life. But I'll tell you something. I'm not coming back here. That thing, whatever it is, it doesn't want us digging in this place." He drove off, leaving me alone at the quarry, as full darkness fell. I should have left too. Should have hiked back to my truck and gone home to Sarah. Instead, I found myself walking to the edge of the flooded pit, trying to understand what the creature had meant. Death waits below. The water was black as oil in the darkness and perfectly still. I shined my flashlight across the surface, but couldn't see more than a few feet down. The quarry was maybe 60 feet deep at the center, deep enough to hide almost anything. As I stood there, I started feeling strange, dizzy, like I was running a fever. The air around the quarry felt thick and oppressive, hard to breathe, and cold, much colder than it should have been for October in West Virginia. Then I started seeing things in the water, shapes moving just below the surface, too big and too purposeful to be fish. At first I thought it was my imagination, but the shapes kept appearing, circling slowly in the black depths. I heard a splash behind me and spun around. Ripples were spreading across the water near the far shore, like something had just surfaced and gone back under. Then another splash, closer this time. I backed away from the edge, my heart pounding. Whatever was down there, the Mothman had been trying to warn us about it. And now I understood why the construction crew shouldn't dig any deeper. Some things are better left buried. I was almost to the tree line when I heard Bill Hendricks scream. His truck was maybe half a mile down the access road, but sound carries far in the mountains. It was a scream of pure agony, cut short suddenly. Then silence. I ran through the woods toward the road, crashing through underbrush and stumbling over fallen logs in the dark. When I reached the access road, I found Bill's truck wrapped around a large oak tree. The impact had been massive. The entire front end was crushed, and steam was rising from the broken radiator. Bill was still alive, but barely. The steering column, he had crushed his chest, and there was blood everywhere. I could hear the wet sound of punctured lungs with every breath he took. "Help me," he whispered when he saw me. I ran back to the quarry to get my radio, calling for an ambulance and the fire department. But even as I made the call, I knew it would be too late. The nearest hospital was 40 minutes away, and Bill and Hendricks didn't have 40 minutes. When I got back to the truck, he was unconscious. I stayed with him until the paramedics arrived, but there was nothing anyone could do. He died before they could get him out of the wreckage. The state police investigated the accident. According to their report, Bill had been driving too fast for conditions and lost control on a curve. The road was dry, his truck was in good condition, and there were no skid marks to suggest he'd tried to brake. But I knew better. The Mothman had warned him that death was waiting, and somehow that warning had become a prophecy. Bill Hendricks had been marked for death the moment he decided to dig in that quarry. After the funeral, I tried to convince myself it was just a coincidence. A tragic accident that had nothing to do with the creature I'd been tracking. But deep down, I knew the truth. The Mothman could see the future, and the future it saw was filled with death. I started having nightmares about bridges. November came with a cold snap that felt more like January. The temperature dropped 30 degrees in 2 days, and ice started forming on the river. I'd never seen the Ohio freeze that early in the season. The Mothman sightings increased. Almost every night, someone reported seeing the creature near Point Pleasant. It appeared at the Silver Bridge twice, perched on the towers like some nightmare gargoyle. Each time, traffic backed up for miles as drivers slowed down to stare. The mayor held a town meeting to address the hysteria. He brought in a professor from West Virginia University, who explained that large birds sometimes became disoriented during migration, and that group psychology could turn a simple misidentification into mass delusion. I attended that meeting but didn't speak up. What could I say? That I'd photographed the creature? That it had spoken to me telepathically? That it had somehow predicted Bill Hendricks' death? After the meeting, I was approached by a reporter named Mary Heyer from the Point Pleasant Register. She'd been investigating the Mothman sightings for weeks, interviewing witnesses, and trying to find rational explanations. "You're the ranger who first investigated the sightings," she said. "What do you really think is going on?" I looked around to make sure we were alone, then decided to trust her. "I think something is trying to warn us," I said quietly. "Something that can see things we can't." Mary studied my face carefully. She was a good reporter. She could tell when someone was lying. "Warn us about what?" "I don't know, but every time that thing appears, something bad happens. And lately, it keeps showing up at the Silver Bridge." Mary nodded slowly. "I've been thinking the same thing. 3 different witnesses saw it near the bridge last week. All of them said it seemed agitated, crying out like it was in pain. That night, I made a decision that probably saved my life. Instead of going to Devil's Den, I drove to the Silver Bridge and parked on the Ohio side. If the Mothman was trying to tell us something about the bridge, maybe I needed to be at the bridge to understand. It was a Tuesday night, December 13th. Light traffic, mostly commuters heading home late from work. I positioned myself where I could see both the bridge structure and the sky above it. At 11:30 p.m., the Mothman appeared. It came from the West Virginia side, flying low over the water. But something was different this time. The creature seemed frantic, almost desperate. It circled the bridge towers 3 times, crying out with that haunting voice. Then it landed on the southern tower and looked directly at me. The telepathic communication was immediate and overwhelming. Not words this time, but images flooding my mind like a movie playing at high speed. I saw the Silver Bridge during rush hour traffic, cars bumper to bumper, moving slowly across the river. Then I saw the southern tower beginning to sway, steel cables snapping one by one under impossible stress. The roadway tilting at a crazy angle as the suspension system failed. And then I saw the collapse. The entire bridge folding into the Ohio River like a house of cards, taking dozens of cars and trucks with it. People screaming, metal twisting, water rushing into sinking vehicles. The vision was so vivid, so real, that I could almost feel the cold river water closing over my head. When it ended, I was on my knees beside my truck, gasping for breath. The Mothman was gone, but its message was crystal clear. The Silver Bridge was going to collapse. Soon, I drove straight to the state police barracks and demanded to speak to the highest-ranking officer on duty. A sergeant named Tom Jenkins listened to my story with growing skepticism, but he knew me well enough to take me seriously. "You're telling me a giant bird showed you a vision of the bridge collapsing?" he asked. "I know how it sounds, Tom, but I've seen this thing predict disasters before. It warned a construction crew about dangerous conditions, and one of them died in an accident 2 hours later." Tom leaned back in his chair, studying my face. "Even if I believed you, James, what am I supposed to do? Close the bridge because a park ranger had a bad dream? Get an engineer out there. Have them inspect the structure. Look for stress fractures, corrosion, anything that might indicate structural failure." Tom promised to pass along my concerns to the highway department, but I could tell he thought I was having some kind of breakdown. I didn't blame him. If someone had come to me with the same story 6 months earlier, I would have recommended psychiatric evaluation. I spent the next 2 weeks trying to find someone who would listen. I called the bridge maintenance office, the county engineering department, even the governor's office. Everyone was polite but dismissive. The Silver Bridge had been inspected just last year, they told me. It was old but safe. On December 15th, 2 days before the collapse, I had my final encounter with the Mothman. I was driving home from another fruitless meeting with highway officials when I saw it standing in the middle of Route 35, about a mile from the bridge. I slammed on my brakes and skidded to a stop just a few feet away from the creature. Up close, it was even more imposing than I remembered. 8 feet tall, with wings that blocked out the streetlights behind it. But this time, I wasn't afraid. I was angry. "Why won't anyone listen?" I shouted through my windshield. "If you know what's going to happen, why don't you do something to stop it?" The creature tilted its head and stepped closer to my truck. When it placed one clawed hand on my hood, the metal actually dented under the pressure. The telepathic communication was softer this time, almost sad. "Cannot change what must be, can only warn. You have done what you could." "It's not enough," I yelled. "People are going to die. Some futures cannot be changed, but you will remember. You will tell others. The warnings will continue." The Mothman spread its wings and launched itself into the night sky. I watched until it disappeared, knowing I would never see it again. 2 days later, On December 17, 1975, at 5:04 p.m. during rush hour traffic, the Silver Bridge collapsed into the Ohio River. 46 people died, and 9 others were never found. I was at home when it happened, watching the evening news with Sarah. The special report interrupted a sitcom, and we watched in horror as helicopter footage showed the twisted remains of the bridge jutting out of the dark water. "Oh my God," Sarah whispered. "That's our bridge. We drive across that bridge." I didn't say anything. Couldn't say anything. I just sat there watching rescue boats search for survivors and thinking about all the people who might have been saved if someone had listened to a park ranger's crazy story about a prophetic moth creature. The investigation took months, but the final report confirmed what the Mothman had tried to tell me. The bridge collapsed due to a stress fracture in a single eye-bar in the suspension chain. The fracture had been growing for years, invisible to routine inspections, until the bridge simply couldn't bear the load anymore. 46 people died because a piece of metal the size of a pencil finally gave way. After the Silver Bridge collapse, I tried to go back to my normal routine, counting birds, maintaining trails, filing reports about routine park activities. But nothing felt normal anymore. The Mothman sightings stopped completely after December 17th. No more red eyes in the darkness. No more haunting cries echoing through the gorge. Whatever the creature was, wherever it had come from, its mission in Point Pleasant was apparently complete. I submitted my final report on the Mothman encounters to the Park Service 6 months later. It was a complete account of everything I'd seen and experienced, including the telepathic warnings and the accurate prediction of the bridge collapse. I knew it would probably end my career, but I had to get the truth on record. My supervisor, District Chief Harold Morrison, called me into his office a week after reading the report. "James," he said, closing the file folder, "this is some very creative writing, but you and I both know the Park Service can't officially acknowledge the existence of whatever you think you saw up there." "No, I know what I saw, Harold, and I have photographs." Harold opened the folder again and looked at the pictures I'd submitted. Even though they were somewhat blurry, the Mothman was clearly visible in 2 of them. "These could be faked," he said finally. "Hell, they probably are faked. Point Pleasant has become a tourist destination because of this Mothman nonsense. People are making money selling t-shirts and bumper stickers. You think I made this up for money? I think you've been under a lot of stress. New marriage, difficult job, isolated working conditions. Sometimes people see things that aren't really there." Harold closed the folder and handed it back to me. "I'm not putting this in your personnel file, James. As far as the official record is concerned, you investigated some unusual wildlife sightings and concluded they were misidentified birds. Case closed." I understood the message. Keep quiet, and I could keep my job. Keep talking about the Mothman, and I'd be looking for new employment. I kept quiet. For a while, Sarah and I moved to Colorado in 1978, where I took a position with the National Forest Service. The work was similar, wildlife management and public education, but the mountains felt safer somehow, cleaner. Like whatever darkness had touched, West Virginia couldn't reach us there. For 20 years, I stuck to Harold Morrison's version of events. When people asked about my time in Point Pleasant, I told them I'd investigated some unusual bird sightings that turned out to be owls and hawks. Just routine wildlife work. But in 1998, a writer named John Keel published a book called The Mothman Prophecies. He'd interviewed dozens of witnesses from the Point Pleasant area, including several people I remembered from my own investigation. His book presented the Mothman as a real phenomenon, possibly connected to other unexplained events around the world. Reading Keel's book convinced me that I wasn't alone. Other people had experienced genuine contact with something beyond normal understanding. And more importantly, similar creatures had appeared before other disasters: earthquakes, plane crashes, industrial accidents. The Mothman wasn't unique to Point Pleasant. It was part of a larger pattern, a warning system that most people couldn't or wouldn't accept. I started talking again, carefully at first, then more openly as I realized the world had changed. The internet allowed people to share strange experiences without fear of ridicule. Television shows explored unexplained phenomena. The government had even acknowledged the existence of unidentified flying objects. In 2002, a movie was made about the Mothman sightings. It took dramatic liberties with the facts, but it got people interested in the real story. I was contacted by several documentary filmmakers who wanted to interview the ranger who photographed the Mothman. I'm retired now, living quietly in a small town in Montana. Sarah passed away 3 years ago. Cancer, and I spend most of my time reading, fishing, and tending a small garden. But I still keep in touch with other Mothman witnesses, and I still pay attention to reports of similar creatures around the world. The sightings continue. Chicago, 2017. Multiple witnesses reported a large, winged humanoid near Lake Michigan. A year later, there were major infrastructure failures in the city. Moscow, 2019. A creature matching the Mothman description was seen near a subway construction site. 6 months later, part of the tunnel system collapsed. The pattern never changes. The creature appears, tries to warn people of coming disaster, then vanishes when the tragedy occurs. Most witnesses are ignored or ridiculed. The warnings go unheeded. I've come to believe that the Mothman and similar creatures are something like guardians, or maybe messengers from a place we don't understand yet. They can see things that are going to happen, terrible things, and they try to warn us, but we're not very good at listening. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd been more persuasive. If I'd found the right words to convince the highway officials to inspect that bridge more carefully. Would those 46 people still be alive? Would the Mothman have appeared at all if the disaster could have been prevented? I'll never know the answers to those questions. But I do know this. The next time someone reports seeing something impossible, something that doesn't fit our understanding of the natural world, I hope the authorities will listen more carefully than they did to me. Because somewhere out there, in the darkness between what we know and what we fear, something is watching. Something that sees the future unfolding like pages in a book. And when disaster approaches, it tries to warn us. The problem is, we keep forgetting how to listen. I still have those photographs from Devil's Den, locked in a safe deposit box at the bank in town. Clear pictures of something that shouldn't exist. Taken by a man who spent his career studying the natural world. Sometimes I think about donating them to a university or a research institute, but I'm not sure anyone would know what to do with them. Maybe that's for the best. Maybe some mysteries are meant to stay mysterious. But I'll tell you this much. If you're ever driving across a bridge late at night, and you see something with glowing red eyes watching from the darkness, don't ignore it. Pay attention to what it's trying to tell you. Your life might depend on it. And if you're ever in West Virginia, near a place called Devil's Den, and you hear that haunting cry echoing off the cliffs, that sound like someone trying to sing but forgetting the words, just remember that you're listening to a voice from somewhere beyond our understanding. A voice that's trying to save us from ourselves. Even if we're too stubborn to listen. James Hawthorne retired from the National Forest Service in 2005 after 32 years of service. He currently lives in Glacier National Park, Montana, where he volunteers with wildlife rehabilitation programs. The Silver Bridge was replaced in 1969 by a new span designed to modern safety standards. Point Pleasant now hosts an annual Mothman Festival, attracting thousands of visitors interested in the unexplained. The original photographs taken by Ranger Hawthorne have never been made public, but several witnesses have confirmed their existence. Sightings of large winged humanoids continue to be reported worldwide, often preceding major disasters or tragedies. The mystery remains unsolved. Asterisk. My name is Maria Flintridge, and I've been a park ranger for 16 years. Before that, I was a police detective in Louisville for 8 years. I thought I'd seen everything bad that people could do to each other. I was wrong. It was July 1987 inches, the Daniel Boone National Forest, Kentucky. The summer was brutal that year. No rain for 6 weeks, and temperatures hitting 95 degrees every day. The trees looked sick, their leaves turning brown at the edges. Even the animals were acting strange, coming down from the mountains looking for water that wasn't there. I work in a section called Copperhead Hollow, about 30 miles from the nearest town. It's a narrow valley between two ridges, maybe 2 miles long and half a mile wide at its widest point. The Cherokee used to live here before they got forced out in the 1832. Local folks say the ground has copper in it, which is how the hollow got its name. They also say it's cursed. but I never believed in that kind of thing. My radio crackled that Tuesday morning around 7 a.m. Ranger Flintridge, we got a report of illegal hunting in your area. 2 men called from Johnson's General Store, said something was stalking them while they were. You know? I knew. Poachers. What kind of something dispatch? They wouldn't say much. Just kept talking about animals that weren't acting right. Sounded pretty shook up. I grabbed my gear and headed out in my truck. The hollow has only one dirt road that goes about a mile in before it turns into hiking trails. The air was thick and still, like breathing through wet cotton. No birds singing, which was odd for that time of morning. I found their campsite easily enough. These guys weren't trying to hide. Empty beer cans, cigarette butts, and a fire pit still warm. But what caught my attention were the tracks around their camp. Lots of different animals had been there. Bear, deer, maybe a mountain lion, and something else I couldn't identify. The weird thing was how the tracks were arranged. They formed a perfect circle around where the men had been sleeping, not scattered like animals would normally leave them, but deliberate, like they'd been watching. I followed their trail deeper into the hollow. The men had run out fast, I could tell by their footprints. Long strides, deep heel marks, they'd been scared. About half a mile from their camp, I found the first dead deer. It was a young buck, maybe 2 years old. But it hadn't been killed by a predator. Someone had cut it open very carefully, taking only specific parts. The heart was missing. So were the eyes and tongue. My grandmother was Cherokee, and she used to tell me stories about the old ways. This looked like something from those stories, ritual killing. But skinwalker legends were Navajo, from out west. This was Kentucky. Different tribes, different traditions. I took photos and made notes, but I was starting to feel uneasy. The air seemed to be getting heavier, and I kept getting the feeling that something was watching me. Every time I turned around, there was nothing there. The second deer was worse. This one had been completely skinned, but the hide was nowhere around. The body was arranged in an unnatural position, almost like it was sleeping. Fresh flies buzzed around it, but they seemed sluggish in the heat. That's when I heard it. A sound I'd never heard before in 16 years of working these woods. It started low, like a growling dog, but then it changed. Got higher, almost like singing. Human singing. I drew my service weapon, a .357 revolver that had never let me down. Park Service, show yourself. The singing stopped. The woods went completely quiet. Even the flies stopped buzzing. I waited for what felt like an hour, but was probably only 5 minutes. When nothing happened, I decided to head back to my truck. But as I walked, I could hear footsteps behind me, matching my pace exactly. When I stopped, they stopped. When I started walking, they started too. I spun around 3 times, gun ready, but saw nothing. Just trees and shadows and the sick-looking grass. Back at my truck, I radioed for backup, but the response was full of static. These radios didn't work well in the hollow on good days, and today wasn't a good day. I'd have to drive back to the main road to get a clear signal. As I started the engine, something moved in my rearview mirror. A large black shape, there for just a second, before it disappeared behind a tree. Could have been a bear, but it moved wrong. Too fluid, too purposeful. I drove out of the hollow faster than I should have on that rough road. At the ranger station, I filed my report and called the county sheriff's office. They said they'd send someone out the next day to investigate the poaching. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about those tracks arranged in a perfect circle and the way the dead animals had been positioned. My grandmother's voice echoed in my head, telling stories about shapeshifters and creatures that could take any form they wanted. Just stories, I told myself. Cherokee folklore mixed up with Navajo legends. But deep down, I knew I was lying to myself. Something was wrong in Copperhead Hollow. Something that had been there long before the Cherokee, maybe even before the first people came to these mountains. I just didn't know how wrong things were about to get. The next morning, Deputy Sheriff Tom Briggs met me at the entrance to the hollow. Tom was a good man. We'd worked together before on hunting violations and drug cases. He was also smart enough to take my reports seriously, even when they sounded strange. "So, what do you think we're dealing with here, Maria?" he asked as we drove in. "Some kind of cult thing? Maybe. Or someone trying to make it look like cult activity to throw us off." I wanted to believe my own words, but something in my gut said this was different. We, reached the first deer carcass around 9 a.m. Tom took one look and whistled low. 16 years on the force, and I've never seen anything like this. You sure this wasn't done by an animal? Look at the cuts, Tom. Those are knife wounds, clean and precise. And see how the heart was removed? That takes knowledge of anatomy. Tom knelt down next to the body, careful not to disturb any evidence. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing. Question is, why take specific parts and leave the rest? We photographed everything and moved on to the second deer. Tom's face went pale when he saw it. Jesus Maria, who skins an animal and then poses it like that? Someone who wants to send a message. We spent the morning collecting evidence and following the poacher's trail. Around noon, we found their truck abandoned about 2 miles deeper in the hollow than I'd been the day before. The doors were open, keys still in the ignition. They left in a hurry, Tom said, looking at the scattered gear in the truck bed. Camping equipment, hunting rifles, cooler full of beer. Nobody leaves this much stuff behind unless they're running for their lives. I checked the truck's interior. No blood, no signs of violence. But on the driver's seat, I found something that made my skin crawl. A single black feather, about 6 inches long. Raven feather, but bigger than any raven I'd ever seen. Tom, look at this. He examined the feather with his flashlight. That's huge. You ever see a raven that size around here? No. And ravens don't usually fly this deep into the hollow. They stick to the ridges. That's when we heard the screaming. It came from deeper in the woods, maybe half a mile away. High-pitched, terrified, definitely human. We both ran toward the sound, crashing through the underbrush with our weapons drawn. The screaming stopped before we got there. We found him in a small clearing surrounded by old-growth trees. Billy Hackett, one of the poachers from yesterday. He was alive, but barely. His clothes were torn to shreds, and he had claw marks across his back and arms. But the worst part was his face, pure terror, like he'd seen something that had broken his mind. Billy, can you hear me? I knelt beside him while Tom called for an ambulance on his radio. Billy's eyes focused on me with effort. It wasn't an animal, he whispered. It talked to me. In Jimmy's voice. Who's Jimmy? My hunting partner. But Jimmy's been dead since yesterday. Tom finished his radio call and came over. Ambulance is 20 minutes out. What happened to him? I was about to answer when Billy grabbed my arm with surprising strength. It knew things, he said. Personal things. About my wife, my kids, things only Jimmy would know. Billy, where's Jimmy now? Billy's eyes rolled back. It ate him. Then it became him. It's still out there, wearing Jimmy's face. He passed out after that. Tom and I waited with him until the paramedics arrived, constantly watching the tree line. The woods were completely silent. No birds, no insects, no wind. Like the whole forest was holding its breath. After they loaded Billy into the ambulance, Tom and I searched the area for Jimmy. We found him about 100 yards from where Billy had been attacked. I've seen a lot of violent death in my career, but nothing like this. Jimmy had been skinned, just like the deer. But unlike the deer, his skin was nowhere to be found. His body was arranged in the same sleeping position as the second deer, arms folded peacefully across his chest. What kind of sick bastard does this? Tom's voice was shaky. I was about to answer when I heard it again, that strange singing from yesterday, coming from all around us, like the trees themselves were making the sound. Tom heard it too. What the hell is that? The singing got louder, more complex, multiple voices now, harmonizing in a way that made my teeth ache. The melody was beautiful and terrible at the same time, like a lullaby written by something that had never been human. We need to get out of here, I said. Now. We started walking quickly back toward our vehicles, but the singing followed us. Sometimes it sounded like it was coming from behind, sometimes from ahead. Once, I could have sworn it was coming from directly above us. That's when I saw Jimmy. He was standing about 50 feet away, between 2 large oak trees. Perfectly normal, perfectly alive. He even waved at us. Jimmy, Tom called out. Thank God you're alive. Your friend Billy's been hurt. Jimmy smiled and started walking toward us. That's when I noticed something wrong with his movement. He was walking, but his feet weren't quite touching the ground. And his smile was too wide, showing too many teeth. Tom, that's not Jimmy. What are you talking about? I can see him right there. Look at his feet. Tom looked down and went rigid. The thing that looked like Jimmy was floating about 2 inches off the ground, leaving no footprints in the soft earth. Run, I whispered. The Jimmy thing heard me somehow, even though I'd barely made a sound. Its head turned toward us with a movement that was too fast, too fluid. The smile never left its face, but its eyes. Its eyes were completely black. We ran. Behind us, the singing turned into laughter. Jimmy's laughter, but multiplied by a dozen voices. It followed us all the way back to our trucks, echoing off the trees and rocks until it seemed to be coming from inside our own heads. We didn't stop running until we reached the main road. That evening, I sat in my cabin trying to make sense of what we'd seen. Tom had gone back to town to file his report, but I could tell he was shaken. 16 years of police work doesn't prepare you for something like that. I called my grandmother in Cherokee, North Carolina. She was 87 years old and had more knowledge of the old ways than anyone I knew. If anyone could explain what was happening in the hollow, it would be her. Grandmother, I need to ask you about something. About shapeshifters. There was a long pause on the line. Maria, where are you calling from? Kentucky. The Daniel Boone Forest. Another pause, longer this time. Child, you need to leave that place. Tonight. I can't leave. People are dying. I think something is killing them and taking their shapes. Describe what you've seen. I told her everything. The arranged deer carcasses, Billy's story about Jimmy talking to him after death, the floating figure that looked like Jimmy but wasn't. When I finished, my grandmother was quiet for a long time. Finally, she spoke in Cherokee first, then translated. What walks on 4 legs in the morning, 2 legs at noon, and as many legs as it chooses at night? Grandmother, this isn't time for riddles. It's not a riddle, child. It's a warning. Your ancestors knew about these things. They called them Nunehai, the immortal ones. But they're not Cherokee. They're older than any tribe, older than humans walking this land. How do I stop it? You don't stop it, Maria. You survive it, and you don't let it get close enough to learn your shape. The line went dead. I tried calling back, but the phone just rang and rang. That night, I barely slept. Every sound outside my cabin made me reach for my gun. Around 3 a.m., I heard footsteps on my porch. Slow, deliberate steps, like someone pacing back and forth. I grabbed my revolver and flashlight, then carefully looked out the window. There was nothing there, but the footsteps continued. They seemed to be coming from directly above me, like someone was walking on my roof. The footsteps stopped right over my bed. I lay there for the rest of the night, gun in hand, listening to the silence and wondering if I was losing my mind. The next morning, I found tracks in the dirt around my cabin. Human footprints that circled the building 3 times, but they ended at the wall. No prints leading away, like whoever made them had just vanished. My radio crackled at 7 a.m. Ranger Flintridge, we've got another situation in the hollow. Old Man Carver is dead. Earl Carver was a local moonshiner who'd been running an illegal still in the hollow for 20 years. I'd busted him twice but never had the heart to push for serious charges. He was 73 years old and harmless, just trying to make a little money selling his corn liquor to tourists. I found his body at his still, deep in the hollow where the trees grew so thick that noon looked like twilight. Like Jimmy, Earl had been skinned. Unlike Jimmy, his skin was hanging from a nearby tree branch like a grotesque flag. But the worst part was the still itself. Someone had been using it recently, the fire was still warm, and there was fresh liquor in the collection jar. Earl's body was already cold. He'd been dead for hours. Who the hell was running his still? I asked the empty woods. That's when I heard Earl's voice behind me. Just making a little batch for the weekend tourists. Ranger Flintridge, you ain't gonna bust me again, are you? I spun around with my gun drawn. Earl stood about 20 feet away, looking perfectly normal except for one thing. His skin was hanging on the tree behind him, which meant what I was looking at wasn't wearing any skin at all. The thing that looked like Earl grinned at me with muscle and bone and teeth. Now don't go pointing that gun at me, Ranger. We're old friends, ain't we? I fired 3 shots center mass. The bullets passed right through it without leaving holes, like shooting through fog. The Earl thing laughed with a sound like grinding glass. You can't kill what's already dead, child. But I can sure as hell kill you. It moved toward me faster than anything human could move. I ran, crashing through the woods without any idea where I was going. Behind me, Earl's laughter echoed through the trees, but it was changing as I listened. Getting higher, more musical, turning back into that terrible singing. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs gave out. When I finally stopped, I realized I was completely lost. The hollow had dozens of small valleys and ridges, and in my panic, I'd gotten turned around. The sun was hidden by thick clouds, so I couldn't tell which direction was which. That's when I heard my own voice calling from up ahead. "Maria, Maria, where are you? I'm lost." I felt my blood turn to ice. It was my voice, exactly. Same tone, same accent, even the slight roughness from years of smoking that I'd quit 5 years ago. "I know you can hear me," my voice called. "I'm scared. Please help me." I drew my gun again, even though I knew it wouldn't help. The thing in the hollow could take any shape, copy any voice. How long before it learned to be me completely? The answer came sooner than I wanted. "I'm Maria Flintridge," my voice said from a different direction now. 16 years Park Service, 8 years police before that. Cherokee grandmother who told me stories about shapeshifters. It knew everything about me, everything I'd told Tom, everything I'd said to my grandmother on the phone. It had been listening. "I know about your nightmares," my voice continued, closer now. "The ones about the case in Louisville. The little girl you couldn't save." I started moving again, trying to stay quiet. My doppelganger's voice followed me through the trees, telling me things about myself that I'd never told anyone. Private fears, secret shames, memories I'd tried to bury. "You blame yourself for your divorce. You think if you'd been a better wife, Tom wouldn't have left you for his secretary." That stopped me cold. My husband's name wasn't Tom, that was the deputy sheriff. My ex-husband was named Robert. The thing was, getting confused, mixing up the people in my life. That gave me an idea. "You're not very good at this, are you?" I called out, "getting your facts mixed up." My voice answered immediately. "I don't know what you mean, Maria. My ex-husband's name was Robert, not Tom. And he left me for his drinking, not another woman." Silence from the woods. "And I was never a police detective in Louisville. I was highway patrol in Lexington." More silence. Then, in a voice that wasn't quite mine anymore, "You're lying." "Am I? If you really knew everything about me, you'd know I was telling the truth." The voice changed again, becoming something between my voice and Earl's and Jimmy's. "It doesn't matter. I'll learn. I have all the time in the world." "Maybe, but you made one big mistake." "What mistake?" I pulled out my backup radio, the emergency one that worked on a different frequency. "You let me keep talking long enough for help to arrive." The static-filled voice of Tom Briggs came through clearly. "Maria, we're tracking your signal. ETA 5 minutes. Are you okay?" "I'm alive," I said into the radio. "But we're going to need more than just the two of us." The thing in the woods let out a shriek that sounded like 10 different voices screaming at once. Trees started shaking all around me, and the temperature dropped 20 degrees in as many seconds. Then everything went quiet. 5 minutes later, Tom found me huddled behind a fallen log, still clutching my radio and gun. He'd brought 3 other deputies and the county coroner. "Where is it now?" Tom asked. "I don't know, but it's learning fast, too fast." We collected Earl's body and skin, but by the time we got back to the still, the fresh liquor was gone. Someone, or something, had been there after we left. That night, I made a decision. I was going to end this, one way or another. But first, I needed to learn the old ways my grandmother had tried to teach me when I was young. The ways I'd ignored because I thought I was too modern, too educated, too sophisticated for Cherokee superstition. I was about to learn that some superstitions exist for very good reasons. I called my grandmother again that night, but there was no answer. Worried, I called the Cherokee police in North Carolina. They found her house empty, with signs of a struggle. Her back door was open, and there were strange tracks in her garden, tracks that looked like they'd been made by something walking on its hands. That's when I understood. The thing in the hollow wasn't just learning about me from what it could hear and see. It was going after the people I cared about, learning from them too. I was on my own. I spent the rest of the night researching everything I could find about Cherokee protection rituals. Most of the books were useless, written by outsiders who'd gotten the details wrong. But I found one old journal in the ranger station library. written by a Cherokee scout named Joseph Ridge in 1839. He'd served with the U.S. Army during the Indian removal, helping to map the paths that would become the Trail of Tears. In his journal, Ridge wrote about something he'd encountered in eastern Kentucky. Asterisk, there is a place the Cherokee call where the skin walks. It is a valley cursed by something older than our oldest stories. The white soldiers want to march the people through this valley because it is the shortest path west. I have told them this is not wise, but they do not listen. The thing that lives there feeds on the shapes of living creatures. It grows stronger with each form it learns. If it ever learns enough shapes, it will be able to leave that valley and spread across the land like a plague. The old medicine men knew ways to bind it, but those men are all dead now. Asterisk, the journal included rough drawings of protective symbols and a list of materials needed for what Ridge called the binding ritual. Most asterisk, gonen and anen of it was in Cherokee, but some was translated. Asterisk, white sage from high places, asterisk, copper, beaten thin as skin, asterisk, water blessed by sunrise, asterisk, blood freely given, asterisk, words of banishment spoken in the old tongue times. I had everything except the Cherokee words. My grandmother had tried to teach me the language when I was young, but I'd been more interested in basketball and boys. Now I wished I'd listened. The next morning, I drove to the nearest college library and found a Cherokee language dictionary. It took me 3 hours to piece together what I thought was the right pronunciation of the banishment words. I wasn't sure if I was getting it right, but it was the best I could do. Then I gathered the other materials: sage from the highest ridge in the forest, copper wire from an old mining claim, water from a spring that faced east, and a small, sharp knife for the blood part that I was trying not to think about. I went back to the hollow at sunset. The thing seemed to be strongest during the transition times, dawn and dusk, when the light was uncertain and shadows could hide anything. I found it waiting for me at Earl's Still, wearing my shape. "Hello, Maria," it said with my voice. "I've been expecting you." "I know what you are now," I said, staying about 50 feet away. "You're one of the Nunahai, the immortal ones." My doppelganger smiled. "Your grandmother taught you well before I ate her." The words hit me like a physical blow. "You're lying." "Am I?" She tasted like memory and regret. All the old ones do. It started walking toward me, and I could see now that it wasn't quite right. The proportions were close, but not perfect. Arms a little too long, eyes a little too wide apart. "She told me about you before she died," the thing continued. "How you always disappointed her. How you turned your back on your heritage for a white woman's badge and gun. Stop talking. She said you were weak, that you'd never be able to stop something like me because you don't believe in anything bigger than yourself." I pulled out the copper wire and started forming it into a circle, the way Ridge's journal had described. The thing that wore my face laughed. "Copper? That's your plan?" "Child, I've been here since before your people knew metal existed." "Maybe, but you've never faced someone who had access to both the old ways and the new ones." I drew my gun and fired all 6 rounds at it. Just like before, the bullets passed through without effect. But this time, I wasn't trying to hurt it. I was buying time to finish the copper circle and start the ritual. The thing realized what I was doing and rushed toward me, but it was too late. I stepped inside the copper circle and began speaking the Cherokee words I'd memorized. My pronunciation was terrible, but the thing stopped moving, as if it had hit a wall. "You can't pronounce them correctly," it snarled. "The ritual won't work." "Maybe not. But it's slowing you down, isn't it?" I was right. The thing was struggling to get closer, like it was pushing against invisible resistance. I continued the chant, adding my own words in English when I forgot the Cherokee. "I banish you back to the deep places. I bind you to this valley. You cannot take new shapes. You cannot leave this hollow." The thing began to change, cycling rapidly through all the forms it had learned. Jimmy, Earl, Billy, me, my grandmother, and dozens of others I didn't recognize. Faces from decades or maybe centuries of victims. "It won't hold," it screamed with 100 different voices. "The binding is incomplete." It was right. I could feel the ritual weakening, the copper circle losing its power. I was missing something crucial. That's when I heard my grandmother's voice, not from the thing but from somewhere else entirely. "The blood, child. You must offer blood freely given. I understood. I took out the knife and cut my palm, letting blood drip onto the copper circle. As each drop hit the wire, it glowed briefly with red light. The thing let out a shriek that shattered tree branches and sent animals fleeing in all directions. Its form began to collapse, all the stolen shapes blurring together into something that was part human, part animal, part something that had never been alive at all. I offer my blood to bind you, I said in English, then repeated it in the best Cherokee I could manage. I offer my blood to protect these mountains. I offer my blood to guard the shapes of the living from your hunger. The thing was smaller now, more contained. But it wasn't gone. You cannot kill me, it whispered. I am immortal. I will wait. I will learn patience. And someday, your blood will weaken, and I will be free again. I know, I said, but that's a problem for another generation. I completed the ritual by burying the copper circle at the center of the clearing, speaking the final words of banishment. The thing gave one last scream and disappeared, not fading away, but simply ceasing to exist in that moment. The woods went completely silent for about 30 seconds. Then, gradually, the normal sounds returned. Birds singing, insects buzzing, wind moving through the leaves. It was over. Or at least, this part was over. The official report listed 3 deaths by unknown animal attack. The FBI briefly got involved because of the ritualistic nature of the killings. But when no more deaths occurred, they moved on to other cases. Tom Briggs never talked about what we'd seen in the hollow, and I didn't blame him. Billy Hackett recovered from his physical injuries, but he never went hunting again. He moved to Florida 6 months later and wouldn't talk about what happened, even to his family. My grandmother's body was never found. The Cherokee police filed a missing person report, but after 6 months with no leads, the case went cold. I drove down to North Carolina once to look through her house. All her books about the old ways were gone, along with her medicine bag and the silver cross she'd worn every day for 60 years. I know she's dead. The thing in the hollow told me it had consumed her, and I believe it. But sometimes, when I'm walking alone in the forest, I hear her voice on the wind, giving me advice or warning me about dangers I can't see yet. I stayed in the Daniel Boone Forest for 3 more years, watching over Copperhead Hollow. The copper circle held. No more strange deaths, no more animals acting like humans, no more singing in languages that predated human speech. But I could feel it down there, waiting, testing the boundaries of its prison, looking for weaknesses in the binding. The ritual I'd performed wasn't permanent. It was more like a lock that would eventually rust away. In 1990, I transferred to a different forest in Virginia. I told my supervisor I wanted a change of scenery, but the truth was, I couldn't stand being the only thing standing between that creature and the rest of the world. I was getting older, and the responsibility was eating me alive. Before I left, I buried a detailed account of everything that had happened in the hollow. I sealed it in a waterproof container and hid it in a place only another Cherokee would think to look. Along with the account, I included instructions for renewing the binding ritual and a list of the materials needed. I also left warnings, signs posted at the entrance to the hollow, written in Cherokee, warning people to stay away from the deep places where the earth remembers what came before humans. Most people can't read Cherokee, but that's the point. The warnings are for the people who would understand what they mean. Every year, on the anniversary of the binding, I drive back to Kentucky and check on the hollow. So far, the copper circle has held. But each year, it's a little weaker. The metal is corroding, and the Cherokee words, I spoke, are fading from whatever spiritual realm they inhabit. I've been training my nephew, Joseph, in the old ways. He's more receptive than I was at his age, more willing to believe that the world contains things that can't be explained by science or law enforcement. When I'm too old to make the annual trip, he'll take over the watch. But I worry about what will happen when there's no one left who remembers the binding ritual, no one who believes strongly enough in the old ways to renew it when the time comes. The thing in Copperhead Hollow isn't the only one of its kind. My grandmother hinted at others, scattered across the country in places where the land itself remembers older truths. Most of them are probably bound the same way, held in check by rituals performed by people whose names have been forgotten by history. How many of those rituals are still holding? How many guardians are left who remember their responsibility? I think about that sometimes, when I can't sleep. I think about what would happen if all the old bindings failed at once, if all the immortal things that hunger for human shapes were suddenly free to spread across the modern world. We live in a time when most people don't believe in anything they can't see or measure. We've forgotten that there are good reasons for some of our ancestors' fears, practical purposes behind what we now call superstition. The Cherokee knew about the things that walk between shapes. They had words for them, rituals to contain them, stories to warn their children. But those words and rituals and stories are dying out, forgotten by people who think they're too educated to believe in monsters. That's the real horror of what I experienced in Copperhead Hollow. Not the creature itself, but the knowledge that it's still down there, waiting for us to forget how to keep it bound. And we are forgetting. Every year, there are fewer people who remember the old ways, fewer who believe strongly enough to maintain the ancient barriers between our world and the things that hunger for it. Someday, someone will go camping in Copperhead Hollow without reading the Cherokee warnings. They'll disturb the copper circle, maybe just by accident. And when they do, the thing that wears the shapes of the dead will be free to learn new forms, to spread beyond the valley that has contained it for so long. I used to think my job was protecting the forest from people. Now I know the truth. I was protecting people from the forest, from things far older and more dangerous than any human threat. That's a responsibility I'll carry until the day I die. And after that, I just hope someone else will be strong enough to carry it forward. Because the alternative doesn't bear thinking about. The mountains remember everything, even the things we wish they'd forget. My name is Patrick O'Sullivan, and I've been a park ranger for 18 years. I've seen plenty of strange things in these mountains, but nothing like what happened at Widow's Peak in November of 1972. I work the Pisgah National Forest in North Carolina, mostly on the old trails where tourists don't usually go. My specialty is keeping the historical trails open and safe. It's honest work, and it keeps me busy enough that I don't think too much about being alone. My wife died 3 years ago, and my 2 daughters live with my sister in town during the school year. The mountains are quiet company, which suits me fine. Widow's Peak Trail is 28 miles from Asheville, up where the air gets thin and the trees grow twisted. We close it every winter when the storms come through, but this November was different. 3 separate hiking groups had come down from that trail in the past month, all telling the same crazy story. They said they heard a woman crying. Not just crying, wailing like her heart was breaking. And they all said the same thing. Right before someone got hurt, they'd see a woman in a white dress standing on the rocks. She'd point and scream like she was trying to warn them about something. The first group was from Georgia, college kids on a weekend trip. One of them, a boy named Tommy, said he saw her clear as day right before his friend slipped and broke his ankle on the loose rocks. She was pointing right at the spot where Jake fell. He told me, his hands shaking as he drank coffee at the ranger station. She was trying to tell us something was wrong. The second group was a family from Tennessee. The father, a big man who looked like he could handle himself, came down white as a sheet. His wife had twisted her knee badly after they heard the crying. My grandfather was from Ireland, he told me quietly. He used to tell stories about banshees, things that warn you when death is coming. But this is America. That stuff isn't supposed to happen here. The third group never made it past the first mile. They heard the wailing and turned right around. Smart choice, maybe. I'd been walking these mountains since I was a boy. My own great-grandfather came over from County Cork back in 1847, settled up in these hills because they reminded him of home. He used to tell stories, too, about spirits that looked after families, warned them when trouble was coming. But those were just stories. Old country tales that didn't mean anything in a place like North Carolina. At least, that's what I told myself. The problem was, people were getting hurt. Not killed, not yet, but hurt bad enough that we had to send rescue teams up 3 times in 1 month. That's not normal for Widow's Peak, even during busy season. And it was November, barely anyone should have been up there at all. My supervisor, Bill Henderson, was getting pressure from the main office. You need to go up there and figure out what's causing these accidents, he told me over coffee and his wife's terrible donuts. Maybe there's loose rock, or the trail markers are wrong. Something that makes sense. Bill was a good man, but he'd only been working these mountains for 5 years. He didn't understand that some things in the hills don't make sense. don't fit into neat reports you can file away in a cabinet. But I had a job to do, and people were getting hurt. So on a gray Tuesday morning, with storm clouds building up over the peaks, I loaded my truck with enough supplies for 3 days and headed up to Widow's Peak. The trail starts easy, winding through pine and oak trees that still had some of their fall colors. But as you climb higher, the trees get smaller and the rocks get bigger. The air tastes different up there. Thinner, colder, like it's been touched by something that doesn't belong in the regular world. Widow's Peak got its name from Sarah McKinnon, a young Irish woman whose husband died at Poston, Gettysburg in 1863. The story goes that she climbed up to the highest point and threw herself off the cliff, couldn't bear to live without him. The local Cherokee said the place was cursed after that her spirit was angry and couldn't rest. I'd always figured it was just a sad story, the kind every mountain has. People die, other people make up ghost stories to explain why bad things happen. It's human nature. But as I hiked up that gray morning, with the wind picking up and the smell of snow in the air, I started to understand why those college kids had been so shaken up. There was something wrong with the quiet up there. Not the good kind of quiet you get in the deep woods, but the kind that makes you look over your shoulder every few steps. The first mile went fine. The trail was in good shape, markers were clear, no obvious hazards. But as I got closer to the spot where the accidents had happened, the feeling got stronger. Like I was being watched by something that didn't want me there. I told myself it was just nerves. 18 years in these mountains, and I'd never let a few ghost stories spook me. Whatever was causing these accidents, it was something real. Loose rocks, bad weather, maybe even a bear that was scaring people into careless mistakes. But when I reached the first turn where you can see the peak itself, I heard it. A sound like wind through the trees, but wrong. Too much like a voice, too much like someone crying for help from very far away. I stopped walking and listened hard, but the sound faded. Just wind, I told myself. Just my imagination working overtime. That's when I noticed the birds weren't singing. The silence was the first thing that really scared me. I've spent most of my adult life in these woods, and I know how they're supposed to sound. There should have been crows calling, maybe a hawk circling overhead, squirrels chattering in the oak trees. Even in November, even with a storm coming, the mountains are never completely quiet. But as I climbed higher toward Widow's Peak, the only sounds were my boots on the trail and my own breathing getting heavier in the thin air. I'd been walking for about 2 hours when I reached the spot where the first accident happened. It was a narrow section of trail with a steep drop-off on one side and a wall of granite on the other. The rocks here were different, darker, with streaks of some mineral that made them look wet even when they were dry. I knelt down and checked the trail surface. It was solid, good footing. Not the kind of place where someone should slip and break an ankle, especially not an experienced hiker like that college boy had been. But there, about 3 feet from where Tommy said his friend Jake had fallen, I found something that made my skin crawl. Footprints. Not hiking boots or trail shoes. These were bare feet, small and narrow like a woman's. But here's the thing that really bothered me. They only went one direction. The prints appeared at the edge of the trail, right where someone would stand to look down at the rocks below, and then they just stopped. Like whoever made them had stepped right off the cliff. I looked over the edge, but it was a 100-foot drop to jagged rocks and rhododendron bushes. Nobody could survive a fall like that. And there was no way to climb down without ropes and proper equipment. The wind picked up while I was examining the prints, and for just a second, I could have sworn I heard something that sounded like a woman's voice. Not words, exactly, but the kind of sound someone makes when they're trying to call out but can't catch their breath. I stood up quick and looked around, but I was alone on the trail. Just granite cliffs and pine trees and the gray sky getting darker by the minute. That's when I saw her. She was standing about 50 yards up the trail, right at the bend where the path curves around a big boulder. At first, I thought she was just another hiker, someone who'd gotten an early start and was heading down while I was heading up. But something about the way she stood there wasn't right. She was too still, like a statue someone had placed on the trail. And her clothes were wrong for hiking. What looked like a long white dress that moved in the wind, even though there wasn't much of a breeze. "Hello," I called out, my voice echoing off the rocks. "You okay up there?" She turned toward me, and even from that distance, I could see her face clearly. It was the face of a young woman, maybe 25 or 30, with dark hair that hung loose around her shoulders. but her expression was all wrong, sad and desperate, like she was trying to tell me something important but couldn't find the words. She raised one arm and pointed back the way I'd come, down toward the parking area. Then she opened her mouth, and the sound that came out wasn't human. It was the wailing I'd heard before, but louder now, clearer. It started low, like wind in a cave, then rose higher and higher until it sounded like a scream of pure grief. The kind of sound you might make if you'd lost everything in the world that mattered to you. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up, and my hands started shaking. Every instinct I had was telling me to turn around and get off that mountain as fast as I could. But I'm a park ranger. It's my job to help people in trouble, even if they're acting strange or might be having some kind of mental breakdown. So I started walking toward her, moving slow and keeping my hands where she could see them. "It's okay," I called out. "I'm here to help. Are you hurt? Are you lost?" The wailing stopped as suddenly as it had started. She looked at me for a long moment, and I could see that her eyes were dark and deep and full of something that might have been pity. Then she stepped backward, around the boulder, and disappeared. I ran the rest of the way to where she'd been standing, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. But when I got there, the trail was empty. No sign that anyone had been there at all, except for more footprints. The same small, bare feet I'd seen before. They led from where she'd been standing to the edge of the cliff, and then they stopped. Just like before. I got down on my hands and knees and looked over the edge, thinking maybe she'd found some way to climb down. But there was nothing. Just empty air and rocks far below. I sat there for a while, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. Maybe it was the altitude affecting my judgment. Maybe the stories those hikers had told me were getting to my head, making me see things that weren't there. But the footprints were real. I could touch them, measure them with my fingers, and the sound she'd made, that wailing, was still echoing in my ears. I pulled out my radio and tried to call the ranger station, but all I got was static. The mountains interfere with radio signals sometimes, especially when there's a storm coming, and looking at the sky, I could tell we were going to get hit hard before the day was over. I had two choices: turn around and head back down, or keep going up to the peak and finish the job I'd come to do. If I went back now, Bill would want to know what I'd found. I'd have to tell him about the footprints, about the woman in white, about the wailing. He'd think I was losing my mind, might even recommend me for a psychological evaluation. But if I kept going, I might see her again, and next time I might not be so lucky. I looked up the trail toward Widow's Peak, then back down toward the parking area. The wind was getting stronger, and I could smell snow in the air. That's when I heard it again. The wailing, fainter this time, coming from somewhere up ahead. It rose and fell like a song, but sadder than any song should ever be. And underneath it, I could have sworn I heard another sound. Rocks moving, shifting, like something heavy was getting ready to fall. I made my decision. I had a job to do, and people were counting on me to figure out what was causing these accidents. Ghost or no ghost, I was going to get to the bottom of it. I shouldered my pack and started climbing again, following the trail toward the peak. But every step of the way, I felt like I was being watched by something that knew a lot more about what was coming than I did. The third time I heard the wailing, it saved my life. I'd been climbing for another hour, and the trail was getting steeper and more dangerous. The rocks here were loose, the kind that shift under your weight and send smaller stones tumbling down the mountain. I could see why people might have accidents in a place like this, especially if they were spooked or not paying attention. But I was paying attention. I was checking every step, every handhold, moving slow and careful like my training had taught me. So when the wailing started up again, coming from somewhere just ahead, I stopped where I was and listened. It was different this time. More urgent, like whoever was making the sound was trying to warn me about something specific. And it was coming from right around the next bend in the trail, where a narrow ledge curved around a cliff face. I'd been about to step onto that ledge when the sound started. Instead, I crouched down and studied the trail ahead. At first, it looked solid enough, granite rock worn smooth by years of weather and foot traffic. But when I looked closer, I could see hairline cracks running through the stone, and some of the smaller rocks were sitting loose, like they weren't really connected to anything underneath. I picked up a fist-sized stone and threw it onto the ledge, about where I would have put my first step. The entire section collapsed. Probably 200 pounds of rock and dirt crashed down the mountainside, leaving a gap in the trail that would have dropped me straight down into a ravine filled with jagged granite. It would have been a 30-foot fall, maybe more. At best, I would have broken both legs. More likely, it would have killed me. My hands were shaking as I backed away from the edge. If I hadn't stopped, if I hadn't heard that warning sound, I'd be dead right now. I sat down on a solid boulder and tried to get my breathing under control. The smart thing to do was turn around and head back down the mountain. Mark this section of trail as dangerous, get a work crew up here in the spring to fix it properly. But as I sat there, I started thinking about those other hikers, the ones who'd reported seeing the woman in white. What if she'd been trying to warn them too? What if the accidents weren't accidents at all, but near misses, people who hadn't listened to what she was trying to tell them? I was still thinking about that when I heard voices coming up the trail behind me. Male voices, laughing and talking loud the way people do when they're trying to convince themselves they're not nervous. I stood up and looked back down the trail and saw 3 men climbing toward me. They were dressed for serious hiking, good boots, heavy packs, the kind of gear that said they knew what they were doing. "Hey," one of them called out when he spotted me. "You seen anything weird up here?" I walked back down to meet them. The one who'd spoken was older, maybe in his 50s, with gray in his beard and the kind of tan you get from spending a lot of time outdoors. The other 2 were younger, probably his sons. "I'm Patrick O'Sullivan, park ranger," I said, showing them my badge. "And yeah, you could say I've seen some weird things. What brings you guys up here so late in the season?" The older man, who introduced himself as Dave Mitchell from Tennessee, looked a little embarrassed. "My dad used to tell stories about this place. He said there was a ghost up here, some woman who died a long time ago. We thought we'd check it out before the trail closed for winter." "Ghost hunting," one of the younger men said with a grin. "Dad's been wanting to do this for years." I looked at the 3 of them. Good men, experienced hikers, but they had no idea what they were walking into. The trail ahead was dangerous, even without whatever supernatural thing was happening up here. And with the storm coming, they could get trapped on the mountain if the weather turned bad fast. "Listen," I said, "I need to tell you guys something. The trail ahead is washed out. Big section collapsed just a few minutes ago. It's not safe to go any further." Dave frowned and looked past me toward the peak. "How much further to the top?" "Maybe another mile, but we've come this far," he said. "There's got to be another way around." I was about to explain that there wasn't, that the only trail to the peak went through the section that had just collapsed when the wailing started again. This time, all 4 of us heard it clearly. It was coming from up ahead, somewhere near the peak, and it was louder than before. Sadder, too, like whoever was making the sound was in terrible pain. The 2 younger men went pale, but Dave Mitchell actually smiled. "There she is," he said quietly, "just like my dad described her." The wailing rose higher, became more urgent, and then it changed. Instead of the wordless crying I'd heard before, this time I could almost make out actual words. It sounded like "go back" and "danger" and something else I couldn't quite catch. "She's trying to warn us," I said, mostly to myself. But Dave Mitchell was already shouldering his pack and heading up the trail. "Come on, boys," he called to his sons. "This is what we came for." "Wait," I called after them. "The trail's not safe." "We'll be careful," Dave called back. "We've been hiking for 30 years. I watched them disappear around the bend, heading toward the collapsed section of trail. I knew what was going to happen. They'd see the washout, maybe try to find a way around it, and end up getting themselves killed or stranded on the mountain. I couldn't let that happen. It was my job to keep people safe, even people who didn't want to listen to good advice. I grabbed my pack and followed them up the trail, moving as fast as I dared on the loose rocks. When I caught up, they were standing at the edge of the washout, looking down at the gap where the trail used to be. "Well, hell," Dave said. "That's a problem." His older son, a man who looked to be about 30, was studying the cliff face on the left side of the gap. "I think we can climb around," he said. "Looks like there's enough handholds." "Are you crazy?" his younger brother said. "That rock's all loose. You put your weight on it, the whole face could come down." I caught up to them just as the wailing started again, but this time it was different. Instead of coming from ahead of us, near the peak, it was coming from right there on the trail, close enough that we should have been able to see whoever was making the sound. But the trail was empty except for the 4 of us. "Where is that coming from?" the younger son asked, looking around nervously. That's when I saw her again. She was standing on the far side of the washout, on the section of trail that was still intact. The same young woman I'd seen before, wearing the same white dress that moved in the wind. But this time, she wasn't just pointing back down the mountain. She was pointing directly at the cliff face where Dave's older son was planning to climb, and her expression was terrified. The wailing got louder, more desperate, and I could hear that sound underneath it again, rocks shifting, getting ready to fall. But this time, it wasn't just a few loose stones. It sounded like the whole mountain was getting ready to come down. We need to get out of here, I said, backing away from the cliff. Right now. But Dave Mitchell was staring at the woman in white, his eyes wide with wonder. Sarah McKinnon, he whispered. It's really her. Dad, his younger son said. Dad, we should listen to the ranger. The woman, Sarah, if that's who she really was, opened her mouth and let out the most heartbreaking sound I've ever heard. It was grief and terror and warning all mixed together, and it was loud enough to echo off every cliff face for miles around. And that's when the mountain started to fall. The first rocks that came down were small, just pebbles and bits of granite that bounced off the trail and rolled into the ravine. But I could hear something bigger moving up above us, something that sounded like thunder rolling through the mountain itself. Move, I shouted at the Mitchell family. Get back down the trail. The younger son grabbed his father's arm and started pulling him away from the cliff face, but Dave was still staring at the woman in white. She was waving at us now, both arms moving frantically, her mouth open in that terrible wailing that seemed to cut right through the sound of falling rocks. She's trying to save us, Dave said, his voice full of wonder. A chunk of granite the size of a car tire crashed down right where his older son had been planning to climb. It hit the trail and shattered, sending sharp fragments flying in all directions. One piece cut across my cheek, and I could feel blood running down my face. She's trying to save us from what she knows is coming, I yelled, grabbing Dave by the shoulder and forcing him to look at me. The whole mountainside is unstable. She's seen this before. That got through to him. His eyes focused, and he nodded. Boys, we're leaving, now. But as we turned to head back down the trail, the woman, Sarah, let out another wail, this one different from the others. It wasn't just warning us about the rocks that were falling. It was warning us about something else, something worse. I looked back toward the peak, and what I saw made my blood turn cold. The entire top of Widow's Peak was moving. Not just rocks falling, the whole summit was sliding sideways, like someone had cut it loose from the mountain underneath. It was happening slow, but it was massive. Millions of tons of rock and dirt and trees, all starting to move at once. And it was heading straight for the trail we'd just climbed up. Run, I screamed. We ran down that trail faster than any of us had ever moved in our lives. Behind us, the sound of the mountain coming apart got louder and louder. Not just rocks falling now, but whole sections of cliff face tearing away and crashing down into the valleys below. Dave Mitchell was keeping up pretty well for a man in his 50s, but his older son was falling behind. The kid was in good shape, but panic can make you clumsy, and the trail was steep and covered with loose stones knocked down by the rockfall. I could hear him breathing hard, could hear his boots sliding on the granite. That's when Sarah appeared again. This time, she wasn't on the trail ahead of us or behind us. She was running alongside us, keeping pace even though her bare feet never seemed to touch the ground. Her white dress flowed around her like water, and her dark hair streamed out behind her in the wind. But she wasn't looking at the trail ahead. She was looking at Dave's older son, and her expression was full of something that might have been compassion. The kid stumbled, went down hard on his hands and knees. His father turned around to help him, but I could see that they weren't going to make it. The rock slide was moving faster now, and the sound of it was like the end of the world. Sarah stopped running and turned to face the mountain that was falling down around us. She spread her arms wide, and the wailing that came out of her wasn't grief anymore. It was defiance. It was a sound like a mother defending her children, like someone who'd lost everything once before and wasn't going to let it happen again. The wind picked up, sudden and strong, and for just a moment the air around us shimmered like heat waves rising off summer pavement. I felt something brush past me, something that might have been invisible hands pushing me forward, helping me keep my balance on the loose rocks. Dave's older son scrambled to his feet, moving faster now, like something was giving him strength he didn't know he had. His father grabbed his arm, and they both started running again, But they were moving easier now, like the trail itself was helping them find their footing. Behind us, the mountain was still coming down, but somehow the rocks weren't following us. They were falling to either side of the trail, crashing into the valleys on both sides but missing the narrow path we were running on. Like something was protecting us. Like Sarah McKinnon, who'd thrown herself off this mountain more than 100 years ago, was using whatever power she had left to make sure we didn't die the same way she had. We made it to the parking area just as the main slide hit the bottom of the mountain. The sound was incredible, like every thunderstorm you've ever heard all happening at once. Trees that had been growing on that mountain for decades were snapping like twigs. Rocks the size of houses were bouncing down the slopes like marbles. But we were safe. All four of us, breathing hard and covered with dust and small cuts from flying stone chips, but alive. I looked back up the trail we'd just run down and saw that it wasn't there anymore. The whole path, from where we stood all the way up to where Widow's Peak used to be, was buried under tons of rock and debris. If we'd been 5 minutes slower getting off that mountain, we would have been buried with it. "My God," Dave Mitchell said, staring up at what was left of the peak. "My God, she saved us." I was about to answer him when I saw her one more time. Sarah was standing at the edge of the rock slide, where the trail used to begin. She looked different now, not as solid as she had before, more like morning mist that might blow away any second. But she was smiling, and for the first time since I'd seen her, she looked peaceful. She raised one hand, not pointing this time, just waving goodbye. Then she turned and walked into the pile of rocks and debris and disappeared. The wailing stopped, the mountain stopped shaking. Even the wind died down to nothing. It was over. The official report called it a geological event, a combination of recent rainfall, temperature changes, and natural erosion that caused a massive rock slide on November 15th, 1972. The experts said it was the kind of thing that happens in old mountains sometimes, and we were lucky no one was hurt. They were right about us being lucky. Bill Henderson asked me a lot of questions about what I'd seen up there, and I told him the truth, mostly. I said I'd heard some strange sounds that might have been wind through rock formations, and that I'd spotted what looked like a hiker in light clothing who disappeared before I could make contact. I said the trail had seemed unstable, and that's why I'd recommended the Mitchell family turn back. I didn't mention the bare footprints, or the way Sarah had run alongside us without touching the ground, or how the rocks had seemed to avoid the trail while we were escaping. Some things don't belong in official reports. Dave Mitchell and his sons came by the ranger station a few days later to thank me for getting them off the mountain safely. Dave shook my hand and looked me in the eye, and I could tell he understood that we'd experienced something together that most people wouldn't believe. "You think she's at peace now?" he asked, quietly, while his sons were looking at maps of other trails they might want to hike. I thought about that for a while before answering. "I think she did what she needed to do," I said finally. "I think she's been trying to warn people about that rock slide for more than 100 years, and now she can rest." Dave nodded. "My dad always said the dead don't stick around unless they have unfinished business. Maybe saving us was her business." After they left, I sat in my office and thought about Sarah McKinnon, a young Irish woman who'd lost her husband in a war and couldn't bear to live without him, who'd climbed to the highest point she could find and jumped, hoping to end her pain. But instead of finding peace, she'd gotten stuck somehow, bound to that mountain, watching people come too close to the same kind of death she'd chosen for herself. And for more than a century, she'd been trying to warn them away, to save them from making her mistake. Maybe that was her punishment, or maybe it was her gift. Maybe both. The trail to Widow's Peak was permanently closed after the rock slide. Too dangerous to rebuild, the experts said. And they were probably right. But sometimes, on quiet days when I'm working the trails nearby, I still hear things that sound like voices on the wind. Not the wailing anymore. That stopped after the mountain came down. Now it's different sounds. Laughter sometimes, or singing like someone who's finally happy. I never saw Sarah again after that day in November, but I think about her often. I think about how she spent more than 100 years trying to save the lives of strangers, how she used whatever power she had left to protect people she'd never met. That's love, I suppose, the kind that doesn't end just because you die. My daughters are older now, living their own lives in the city. But when they come to visit, I tell them the story of Widow's Peak, the real story, not the one in the official reports. I tell them about Sarah McKinnon and how sometimes the dead look after the living in ways we don't expect. They listen politely, the way children do when their father tells them old mountain tales, but I see something in their eyes that tells me they understand. This is a place where the past doesn't stay buried, where love and loss and sacrifice leave marks that time can't erase. 18 years I've been working these mountains, and I've learned that there are things up here older and deeper than any government report can explain. Things that connect us to the people who came before, who lived and died and loved in these same hills and valleys. The mountains remember everything, and sometimes, when someone needs saving, they send that memory back to help. I'm retiring next spring, but I'll keep coming back to these trails. Not as a ranger anymore, just as someone who understands that we're not alone up here, that we're part of something bigger than ourselves. And on quiet days, when the wind is just right, I'll listen for Sarah's voice. Not the wailing this time, but the sound of a woman who finally found the peace that had been waiting for her all along. The sound of someone who came home at last. My name is Samuel Ironforge, and I've been a park ranger for 21 years. People think my job is about helping lost hikers and putting out campfires, but that's not the whole truth. The real work happens in places where cell phones don't work, and the nearest hospital is 2 days away on foot. I work the back country of the Great Smoky Mountains, mostly around Thunderhead Mountain. It's a 5,527-foot peak that sits 40 miles from the nearest town. When something goes wrong up there, I'm usually the only help coming. Before I became a ranger, I spent 8 years in the Marines. I learned to shoot straight, think clear, and not panic when things get bad. That training saved my life more times than I can count, especially when dealing with black bears and wild boar. But nothing in the Marines prepared me for what I found on Thunderhead Mountain in August of 1991. The mountain got its name from the storms that hit it almost every afternoon during summer. Lightning strikes the peak more than anywhere else in the park. The Cherokee people who lived here first had stories about thunder beings that lived in the high places. I always figured those were just old tales to explain the weather. My partner Jake used to laugh about the monster reports we'd get every few months. Hikers would swear they saw something that wasn't a bear, walking on 2 legs through the woods. "Sam," he'd say, "put a black bear in bad light and poor weather, and people's minds will turn it into King Kong." I believed him. After 2 decades of finding logical explanations for strange tracks and weird sounds, I thought I'd seen everything these mountains could throw at me. Bears standing up to get a better smell, elk making noise in the brush, wild boar tearing up campsites. Always something normal once you looked close enough. The weather had been rough that summer. More storms than usual, and stronger ones too. Lightning strikes started 3 forest fires in July alone. The old-timers in Gatlinburg said they'd never seen anything like it. I was finishing up my evening patrol on August 15th when the radio crackled to life. The voice was shaky, young, scared. "Ranger Station, this is emergency. We need help on Thunderhead. Something attacked our camp. Please, we need help right now." I grabbed the radio. "This is Ranger Ironforge. What's your exact location?" We're about 2 miles up the Appalachian Trail from the Thunderhead summit, near that old rock slide. There's been, God, I don't know how to say this, something huge came out of the storm. It killed my friends. My blood went cold. "Are you injured? How many people with you?" "It's just me now. Mark and Sarah are. They're dead." This thing, it was like 10 feet tall, and when the lightning hit, the radio went quiet for a long moment. Then, "Please hurry, I think it's still out there." I was already loading my pack with medical supplies and emergency gear. The storm the kid mentioned had passed through around sunset, but there were more clouds building to the west. Weather Service said another big system would hit around midnight. "I'm on my way," I told him. "Stay where you are, make noise so I can find you, and keep talking to me every 10 minutes. The hike to that part of Thunderhead takes 3 hours in daylight. In the dark, with a heavy pack, it would take at least 4. I had my high-powered flashlight, my .45 service weapon, and a flare gun. Standard gear for a night rescue in bear country. But as I started up the trail, something felt different. The air was too still. No night birds singing. No insects buzzing. Even the wind had stopped. In 21 years of walking these mountains at night, I'd never heard them so quiet. I checked my radio every few minutes, but the kid had stopped responding after the first hour. That worried me, but radio dead zones were common this far up the mountain. I kept climbing, following the beam of my flashlight up the narrow trail. About halfway to the reported location, I started noticing things that didn't feel right, small things at first. Tree branches broken off at about 10 feet high, way too high for a bear to reach. Rocks that looked like they'd been thrown instead of naturally fallen. The smell of ozone in the air, like the moment before lightning strikes. Then I found the first track. It was pressed deep into the mud beside a small creek. At first glance, it looked almost human. 5 toes, a heel, an arch. But it was huge. Maybe 18 inches long and 8 inches wide. The depth of the impression meant whatever made it weighed at least 400 pounds. I knelt down and shined my light on it carefully. The toe marks were strange, too long, with what looked like claw marks at the tips. But the strangest thing was around the edges of the track. The mud was slightly melted, like something very hot had stepped there. I took photos and made a plaster cast, standard procedure for unusual animal sign. But my hands were shaking as I worked. In all my years tracking bears, elk, and even mountain lions, I'd never seen anything like this. The silence was getting worse. No owl calls, no rustling in the brush, no sound at all except my own breathing and heartbeat. Every instinct I developed as a Marine and a Ranger was telling me something was very wrong. I loaded a round into my pistol and kept climbing toward whatever was waiting for me in the dark. The kid's campsite looked like a war zone. I found it just after midnight, about where he said it would be. 3 tents arranged in a triangle around a fire pit, but everything was destroyed. The tents were shredded, not clawed but burned through like someone had taken a blowtorch to them. Sleeping bags and gear scattered everywhere, some of it hanging in trees 20 feet off the ground. I called out, "Hello, Ranger Ironforge, where are you?" No answer. Just that unnatural silence that had been following me up the mountain. I swept the area with my flashlight, trying to piece together what happened. The fire pit was strange. The rocks around it were melted and fused together like glass. That takes temperatures of over 2,000 degrees. No normal campfire burns that hot. Then I found the first body. Mark was about 30 yards from the camp, lying face down next to a big oak tree. When I turned him over, I had to fight not to throw up. He'd been burned, but not by fire. His chest and arms looked like he'd been struck by lightning, with those telltale fern-pattern burns across his skin. But there was no burn damage to his clothes or the ground around him. I'd seen lightning strike victims before. This looked similar, but wrong somehow, too precise. Lightning doesn't usually kill you without burning your clothes or leaving char marks on nearby trees. "Sarah," I called out, "if you can hear me, I'm here to help." I found her about 50 yards away, near the edge of a steep drop-off. Same type of burns as Mark, same impossible precision. Her camera was lying next to her, the expensive professional model. I checked it, and the film had been completely melted inside the case. But no sign of the third hiker, the one who'd called for help. I was examining Sarah's body when I heard it, a sound like a tree falling, but with a rhythm to it. Slow, heavy footsteps coming up the trail behind me. I drew my weapon and spun around, flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. "Who's there?" "This is a park ranger." The footsteps stopped. I waited, barely breathing, finger on the trigger. My light showed maybe 50 feet of trail before it disappeared into the trees. Nothing moving, no reflection, from eyes or metal. Then I heard breathing. Not human breathing. Something much larger, like a horse or a bull, but slower and deeper. Each breath sounded like wind through a cave. "I'm armed," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "Identify yourself." The breathing stopped. Then, very softly, I heard what sounded like electricity crackling, like when you rub a balloon on your hair, but much louder. My flashlight started flickering. Then my radio began picking up static. All my electronic gear was going haywire, needles jumping on my compass, digital watch display scrambling. That's when I saw the eyes. 2 points of blue-white light, about 10 feet off the ground, watching me from the tree line, not reflecting my flashlight beam, producing their own light, like small stars floating in the darkness. I raised my pistol. "Stay back." The eyes moved, gliding smoothly to the left, then right, like whatever they belonged to was studying me. The electrical crackling got louder. I could smell ozone again, stronger now, making my nose tingle. My flashlight died completely. The only light came from those impossible eyes and the faint glow of my watch face. In the darkness, I could hear something moving through the trees. Not footsteps now, but branches breaking, rocks sliding, like something massive was circling the camp. I fumbled for my flare gun with my free hand, never taking my eyes off those blue lights. When I found it, I aimed up and fired. The flare burst above the trees, bathing everything in red light for maybe 30 seconds. In that brief moment, I saw it clearly. It stood between two large pine trees, partially hidden but unmistakable. Humanoid but wrong in every way. 10 feet tall, covered in dark hair or fur, with arms that hung almost to the ground. The head was huge, more like a bear's than a human's, but it stood perfectly upright on two legs. But the worst part was its skin. In the flare light, I could see electricity dancing across its body like Street Elmo's fire. Blue sparks jumped between its fingers. Its eyes weren't just glowing, they were like looking into lightning bolts. The flare died, and everything went black again. I heard that crackling sound again, much closer now. Then a voice, deep and rumbling like distant thunder, speaking words I didn't understand. It might have been Cherokee, or maybe something much older. Whatever it was trying to communicate. I kept my gun pointed toward where I'd seen it, but my hands were shaking so bad I couldn't have hit anything. What do you want? The answer came as a flash of light so bright it left spots in my vision. When my sight cleared, the creature was gone. But carved into the tree trunk behind where it had stood, burned deep into the wood, was a symbol I'd seen before in old Cherokee drawings. A jagged line representing lightning enclosed in a circle. My radio crackled back to life. Ranger Ironforge, this is base station. Do you copy? I grabbed the radio with a trembling hand. Base, this is Ironforge. I need backup and a medical team at the Thunderhead Trail coordinates I logged. Multiple fatalities. Roger that. What's the situation? I looked around at the melted campfire, the burned bodies, the symbol carved into the tree by something that shouldn't exist. Lightning strike, I said finally. Multiple lightning strikes. It was the only explanation anyone would believe. But as I waited for backup, sitting in the dark with two dead hikers and the smell of ozone still in the air, I knew I'd encountered something that had nothing to do with weather and everything to do with the old stories the Cherokee used to tell about the things that lived in the high places. The thunder being was real, and it was protecting its mountain. The next 3 weeks were the worst of my career. I filed my report about the lightning strike deaths, but I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd really seen up there. The official investigation blamed the unusual number of electrical burns on the severe storm conditions, and everyone seemed satisfied with that. Explanation: everyone except me. I started spending my off-duty hours in the library, reading everything I could find about Cherokee legends and the history of Thunderhead Mountain. What I learned kept me awake at night. The Cherokee called it Agan Unitsi, the lightning dweller. According to their stories, it was a guardian spirit that lived in the high places and commanded the storms. When white settlers first came to the area in the 1800s, they reported strange encounters with a thunder beast that could call down lightning at will. But the most disturbing thing I found was a series of newspaper articles from 1923. A logging company had set up a camp near Thunderhead Summit, planning to clear-cut the old-growth forest. Over the course of 2 months, 13 loggers died in what the papers called freak electrical accidents. Men struck by lightning on clear days, equipment spontaneously catching fire, tools melting in workers' hands for no reason. The logging company finally abandoned the site after the foreman reported seeing a giant devil covered in lightning walking through their camp at night. The area had been left untouched ever since. I was reading those old articles when my radio buzzed. Another emergency call. This time from a professional photographer who'd been taking pictures of storm formations around Thunderhead. Ranger Station, this is Bill Henderson. I'm at the overlook on the north face of Thunderhead, and I need immediate assistance. Something's wrong up here. I grabbed my gear. What kind of assistance, Mr. Henderson? I don't know how to explain this. I came up here to photograph the storm clouds, but there's something in them, something big. And my equipment keeps malfunctioning every time I try to take a picture. I was already heading for my truck. After what happened to the backpackers, I wasn't taking any chances. Stay where you are. I'm on my way. The drive to the North Face trailhead takes about an hour, and storm clouds were building again as I climbed toward the overlook. Henderson had said he'd be at Eagle Point, a rocky outcrop that gives you a clear view of the entire valley. I found his truck in the parking area, but no sign of Henderson himself. His camera bag was on the front seat, expensive lenses scattered across the dashboard. All the electronic equipment looked fried. LCD screens cracked, metal bodies warped like they'd been heated and cooled rapidly. The trail to Eagle Point is only half a mile, but it's steep and exposed. As I climbed, I could feel electricity in the air. My hair was standing up, and every piece of metal I was carrying felt warm to the touch. I found Henderson's body at the overlook. He was lying flat on his back on the rocky ledge, arms spread wide, staring up at the sky. Like the backpackers, he showed signs of severe electrical burns, but his clothes and the ground around him were untouched. His expensive camera was beside him, the lens cap melted into a solid lump of plastic. But this time, there was evidence. Henderson had been taking pictures right up until the moment he died. His film was ruined, but the camera's memory card had somehow survived. When I got back to the station and downloaded the images, I found something that made my blood freeze. The last dozen photos showed the storm clouds above Thunderhead, but there was something moving in them. A dark shape, human-like but massive, riding the lightning bolts like they were solid ground. In the final image, taken just seconds before Henderson died, you could clearly see it descending toward the overlook, arms outstretched, electricity streaming from its fingers. I stared at that photo for hours. There was no way to fake something like that, especially not in 1991. But there was also no way to explain it without sounding completely insane. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the Cherokee stories, about the logging camp, about what I'd seen in the forest. This thing, whatever it was, wasn't randomly killing people. It was defending its territory. Around 2 a.m., my phone rang. The voice on the other end was shaky. Elderly. Ranger Ironforge? This is Mildred Webb. I'm sorry to call so late, but something terrible has happened to my husband. I knew the Webbs. They were both in their 70s, experienced hikers who'd been coming to the Smokies for decades. If they were calling for help, it was serious. What's wrong, Mrs. Webb? Harold went for a sunrise hike up to Thunderhead this morning. He was supposed to be back by noon, but we just found him. God help us, he's been burned. But there's no fire damage anywhere else. I was already getting dressed. Where are you now? At the emergency room in Gatlinburg. The doctors don't understand what happened. They're saying it looks like he was struck by lightning, but Harold swears there wasn't a cloud in the sky when it happened. I drove to the hospital, but Harold Webb died before I got there. The doctors showed me his injuries, the same precise electrical burns I'd seen on the others, but this time there was a witness. Harold had been conscious when they brought him in. Before he died, he told his wife what happened. He'd been hiking the ridge trail just after sunrise when he saw something that shouldn't exist. A creature standing on top of a boulder, 10 feet tall, covered in electricity like a living storm cloud. When it saw him, it raised one hand and pointed at him. Lightning came out of its finger. Harold threw himself behind a tree just as the bolt hit, which probably saved his life for a few extra hours. But the electrical energy had jumped from the tree to him, burning him from the inside out. He kept saying it wasn't an animal. Mrs. Webb told me through her tears. He said it was something else, something old and angry that didn't want people on the mountain anymore. Standing in that hospital hallway, looking at the fourth victim in less than a month, I realized the truth that I'd been trying to avoid. The thunder being wasn't just real, it was escalating. Each attack had been more direct, more aggressive. First the backpackers in the dark during a storm, then the photographer in broad daylight. Now Harold Webb on a clear morning with perfect visibility. It was sending a message, stay off my mountain. But as a park ranger, I couldn't just close down a major trail system without proof that would satisfy bureaucrats and lawyers. I needed evidence that would hold up to official scrutiny. I needed to confront this thing directly and live to tell about it. I went home and started planning. If the Thunder Being wanted to defend its territory, I was going to give it a fight. I just hoped I was smart enough to survive it. I spent 3 days preparing for what I knew would be my last trip up Thunderhead Mountain. I couldn't use normal weapons against something that controlled electricity. My gun, radio, and flashlight would be useless the moment that thing got close. So I went old school. A hunting knife, a compass, waterproof matches, and an emergency whistle. Everything non-electronic that might help me survive. I also studied everything I could find about electromagnetic fields and electrical grounding. If this creature was essentially a living lightning bolt, there had to be ways to protect myself, or at least avoid being its easiest target. The Weather Service predicted major thunderstorms for August 30th, starting around sunset. Perfect. If I was right about the connection between the thunder being and storm activity, that would be when it was strongest. But it would also be when I might have the best chance to understand what it really was. I told my supervisor I was doing a routine patrol of the high country and would be back the next morning. Then I started hiking up Thunderhead just after lunch, giving myself plenty of time to reach the summit before the storms hit. The mountain felt different that day. More alive somehow. The air was thick and still, but I could feel energy building like pressure behind a dam. Birds were flying lower than usual. Squirrels and chipmunks had disappeared completely. Even the insects were quiet. About halfway up, I started finding more of those strange tracks. They were everywhere now, pressed deep into the trail, circling trees, leading off into the thick forest on both sides. Some were fresh, made within the last few hours. Others looked weeks old, but were perfectly preserved, as if the ground around them had been baked hard by intense heat. I also found trees with that same lightning symbol burned into the bark. Dozens of them, like territorial markings. They formed a rough circle around the upper part of the mountain, starting at about 4,000 feet elevation. Warning signs. I was entering its domain. I reached the summit just as the first clouds started building to the west. Thunderhead's peak is mostly bare rock, with just a few stunted trees and some scattered boulders. There's an old fire tower there, abandoned since the 1962, that gives you a view for miles in every direction. I climbed up into the tower and settled in to wait. If the thunder being was going to show itself, this is where it would happen. The storm hit just after sunset. I've seen a lot of mountain thunderstorms, but this one was different. The lightning didn't flash randomly. It moved in patterns, like something was controlling it. Bolts would strike the same spots over and over, or dance between the peaks in ways that defied everything I knew about electricity. And then, in one brilliant flash that lit up the entire mountain, I saw it. The thunder being stood on a boulder about 100 yards away, arms raised toward the sky, electricity flowing around it like water. It was even bigger than I'd thought, at least 12 feet tall, with massive shoulders and arms that looked like they could tear trees out of the ground. But it wasn't an animal. Not exactly. In that moment of perfect visibility, I could see that it was partially transparent, like it was made of energy as much as flesh. Its skin rippled with constant electrical discharge. Its eyes weren't just glowing. They were pure light, like looking into the heart of a lightning bolt. It saw me in the tower and let out a roar that wasn't heard so much as felt. The sound rolled across the mountain like thunder, shaking the metal structure I was hiding in. Then it started walking toward me. Each step it took sent sparks flying from the ground. When lightning struck near it, the bolt seemed to bend toward its body, feeding it, making it brighter and more solid. This thing didn't just command storms, it was powered by them. I climbed down from the tower and started backing away, but there was nowhere to go. The summit of Thunderhead is surrounded by steep drops on 3 sides. The only way down was past the creature, and it was blocking that path. It stopped about 50 feet away and spoke. The words were in Cherokee, but somehow I understood them. Maybe it was speaking directly into my mind, or maybe fear had made me more aware than I'd ever been before. "You do not belong here," it said. "Your kind brings death to the green places. Go back to your valleys and your roads and your cities. Leave the high places to those who were here first." I found my voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. "I'm not here to hurt anything. I just want to understand. Understanding is not for you. Understanding comes only through becoming one with the storm. Would you like to understand as the others did?" It raised one massive hand, and electricity began crackling between its fingers. I could feel the hair on my arms standing up. The air tasted like copper and ozone. "Wait," I said desperately. "I've read the old stories. The Cherokee respected you. They knew you were here. I respect you too." The creature tilted its head, considering. The first people knew the proper ways. They took only what they needed. They left the sacred places undisturbed. But your people see a mountain and want to cut it down, see a forest and want to burn it, see running water and want to poison it. It was talking about the logging camp, about the development pressures that threatened every wilderness area in the country. This wasn't just a territorial dispute. It was environmental protection on a scale I'd never imagined. Not all of us are like that, I said. Some of us are trying to protect these places. Show me. The command hit me like a physical force. I knew instinctively what it meant. This was a test. The Thunder Being was offering me a choice. Prove my commitment to protecting its mountain, or join the others who had died. How? I asked. Instead of answering, it gestured toward the storm clouds above us. Lightning was striking all around the summit now, hitting the same spots repeatedly, building up electrical charge in the rocks and metal of the old fire tower. Then I understood. It wanted me to trust it completely, to stand in the middle of a lightning storm and believe that it would protect me if my intentions were pure. It was insane. It was also the only chance I had of surviving this encounter. I walked to the center of the summit, directly under the worst of the lightning activity, and raised my hands toward the sky. I swear to protect this mountain and everything on it. I swear to keep people away from the places where they don't belong. I swear to remember what I've seen here and to honor it. The Thunder Being watched me for a long moment. Then it nodded and spoke one word in Cherokee that I somehow knew meant truth. Lightning struck. The bolt hit me directly, but instead of burning me alive, it felt like being filled with liquid light. Every nerve in my body exploded with energy, but it didn't hurt. It was like touching the fundamental force that powers the universe. For just a moment, I could see what the Thunder Being saw. The mountain as a living entity, connected to every plant and animal and stone. The storm as a cleansing force, washing away pollution and decay. The creature itself as a guardian spirit that had protected this place for thousands of years. Then the vision ended, and I collapsed to the ground, unconscious. I woke up 12 hours later in a hospital bed in Gatlinburg. The official report said I was struck by lightning during a routine patrol and found by search and rescue teams the next morning. The doctors couldn't explain why I survived a direct lightning strike with only minor burns and temporary paralysis. They called it a miracle. I knew better. When I was discharged 3 days later, I found that my supervisor had left a message. There had been complaints from hikers about unusual electrical activity on Thunderhead, and park management was considering closing the upper trails until they could investigate. I called him back immediately. "Don't close the trails," I said, "but we need to put up warning signs about severe weather conditions, and we need to limit group sizes to no more than 4 people at a time." Why the restrictions? I thought about the Thunder Being's words, about the difference between taking only what you need and destroying everything you touch. Large groups cause too much damage to the ecosystem. Smaller parties will be safer and have less environmental impact. He agreed, and within a month, new regulations were in place. Group size limits, mandatory weather awareness training, and enhanced storm warning systems. To hikers, it looked like reasonable safety measures. To the Thunder Being, I hoped it looked like good faith effort to protect its domain. The strange deaths stopped. Over the next 2 years, I had 3 more encounters with the creature, always during major storms. But these weren't confrontations, they were more like check-ins. It would appear at the edge of my vision, watch me for a few minutes, then disappear back into the lightning. I kept my promise. When developers tried to build a cell tower on Thunderhead's north face, I buried their environmental impact study in paperwork and regulations until they gave up. When a mining company showed interest in the mineral rights near the summit, I made sure their geologists got lost on every survey trip until they decided the area was too difficult to access. Some people called me overzealous. My supervisor occasionally questioned my enforcement decisions. But the mountain stayed protected, and no one else died from freak lightning strikes. I retired from the Park Service in 2010, after 39 years of service. At my retirement party, they gave me a plaque that called me Guardian of the High Country. If they only knew how accurate that title was. These days, I live in a cabin about 10 miles from Thunderhead's base. On nights when the storms roll in, I sometimes see flashes of blue light dancing among the clouds above the summit. Local weather forecasters can't explain why Thunderhead generates so much more electrical activity than neighboring peaks. I could tell them, but they wouldn't believe me. New rangers patrol those trails now, younger people who grew up with GPS and satellite phones and scientific explanations for everything. They file reports about unusual animal tracks and strange electromagnetic readings, but they always find logical explanations. That's probably for the best. But sometimes, late at night, when the thunder is rolling across the mountains, I hear that voice again, deep and powerful, speaking words in a language that existed long before English, reminding me of promises made and kept. The thunder being is still up there, still protecting its mountain. The Cherokee knew what they were talking about when they said some places are sacred. Some places are guarded by forces older and more powerful than anything we can understand. I kept my word for 23 years. The mountain stayed safe, the storms kept coming, and the guardian spirit continued its ancient vigil. Next week, my grandson starts his first job as a seasonal ranger in the Great Smoky Mountains. I've been teaching him about wilderness safety, proper trail etiquette, and respect for the natural world. But most importantly, I've been teaching him about the old stories and the things that live in the high places. He thinks they're just interesting folklore. For now, that's enough. But if he ever finds himself on Thunderhead Mountain during a thunderstorm, if he ever sees blue lights dancing in the clouds or hears voices speaking in the thunder, he'll remember what his grandfather told him about respecting the things he doesn't understand. And maybe, if he's very lucky and very wise, the thunder being will recognize in him the same spirit of protection that it saw in me. Some mountains choose their own guardians. Some guardians are human, some are not. And some promises, once made to the storm itself, last forever.